Welcome, dear listener, to Sleepy Rain Horror, where the line between dreams and nightmares blurs. As you drift into the unknown, remember that some whispers are better left unheard. But here, they're impossible to ignore. If you enjoy this tales and haven't fallen asleep yet, or are brave enough to stay awake, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Let's see if you can make it through to the end without a single scream. The house on Blackthorn Hill had stood for over a century, a hulking shadow on the edge of a forgotten town. Locals whispered about it in hushed tones, weaving tales of spirits and curses, of strange lights flickering in the windows on moonless nights. Most kept their distance, unwilling to test the validity of the rumors. But for Lauren, the house was a challenge. It began with an invitation. An unassuming envelope slipped under her apartment door. The paper was aged, the writing in an elegant looping script that felt eerily familiar. It read, "Dear Ms. Lauren Carter, you are cordially invited to the reading of the last will and testament of Eleanor Blackthorn. Attendance is required. Date, October 31st. Time, midnight. Location, Blackthorn Manor, Blackthorn Hill." Lauren had never heard of Eleanor Blackthorn. She had no family by that name, or so she thought. The invitation was peculiar, but curiosity outweighed her trepidation. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was important, though she couldn't explain why. When she arrived in the town at dusk, the streets were eerily empty. A cold wind carried the scent of rain, rustling the dying leaves that littered the cracked pavement. The directions to Blackthorn Hill were straightforward, and soon Lauren found herself staring at the looming silhouette of the manor. The house was massive, its Gothic architecture imposing even in the dim light. Its windows were dark, its roof sagging under the weight of years. Ivy climbed its stone walls like skeletal fingers, and the air was heavy with the smell of damp wood and decay. She hesitated at the gate, her fingers brushing the iron bars. For a moment, she considered turning back, but something unseen seemed to pull her forward. The gate creaked open under her touch, and she stepped onto the overgrown path that led to the front door. Inside, the house was no less foreboding. The grand foyer was dimly lit by a single chandelier, its candles flickering weakly. The air was cold, and a thick layer of dust covered every surface. A spiral staircase wound upward, disappearing into shadows, while darkened hallways stretched out on either side. Lauren called out, her voice echoing through the empty space. "Hello? Is anyone here?" There was no response, only the creak of the old wooden floor beneath her feet. She glanced at her watch, 11:55 p.m. She was early. A sense of unease settled over her as she explored the ground floor. The rooms were furnished but lifeless, as though the house had been frozen in time. A faint smell of mildew lingered in the air, and the silence was oppressive. At midnight, the grandfather clock in the corner struck 12, its chime echoing through the house. As the final note faded, Lauren felt a chill crawl down her spine. From the top of the staircase, a soft voice called her name. Lauren. She spun around, her heart pounding. Standing at the top of the stairs was a woman in a long black gown. Her face was pale, her features delicate but unfamiliar. Her eyes glinted in the dim light, and her lips curled into a faint smile. "Welcome," the woman said, her voice soft but commanding. "You're right on time. Who are you?" Lauren asked, her voice trembling. "My name is Eleanor Blackthorn," the woman replied, descending the staircase with an unnatural grace. And I have been waiting for you. Lauren's breath caught in her throat. Eleanor's presence was unsettling, her movements too smooth, her gaze too piercing. I don't understand, Lauren said, taking a step back. Why am I here? Eleanor reached the bottom of the stairs, her dark gown pooling around her feet like spilled ink. She tilted her head, studying Lauren with an almost predatory curiosity. You are here because you are my heir, Eleanor said simply. This house, this legacy, it all belongs to you now. Lauren blinked, her mind struggling to process the words. Heir, I've never met you before. I don't have any family. You have more family than you realize, Eleanor interrupted, her tone sharp. The blackthorn blood runs through your veins, whether you know it or not. Lauren shook her head, stepping away from the woman. This is some kind of mistake. I don't want anything to do with this. Eleanor's smile faded, her expression hardening. It is not a matter of want, child. The house has chosen you, and once it chooses, there is no escape. A deep, resonant sound echoed through the house, like the groaning of the earth itself. The air grew colder, and Lauren's breath came out in visible puffs. What's happening? She demanded, her voice rising in panic. The house is waking, Eleanor said, her voice calm but tinged with something dark. It has been asleep for too long, waiting for the rightful heir to return. Now that you are here, it will reveal itself to you. The walls seemed to shift, the shadows growing darker and deeper. Lauren's head spun, and she felt an inexplicable pull toward the staircase. Eleanor gestured toward the steps. Go. The house will show you what you need to see. Lauren hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to run, to leave and never look back. But the pull was too strong, the weight of Eleanor's gaze too heavy. She found herself climbing the staircase, her legs moving as though compelled by an unseen force. At the top, the hallway stretched out into darkness, its end invisible. Doors lined the walls, each one slightly ajar. A faint whispering sound came from somewhere ahead, too faint to discern but impossible to ignore. Lauren's hand trembled as she pushed open the nearest door. Inside, the room was empty, save for a single chair facing a window. The whispering grew louder, and she realized it wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from the walls. She stepped back, her pulse racing, and turned to the next door. This one opened into a library, its shelves lined with ancient, dusty books. A single candle burned on a desk in the center of the room, casting flickering shadows. As she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her. Lauren. The voice came from the shadows, deep and resonant. She spun around, her eyes darting across the room, but there was no one there. Who's there? She demanded, her voice shaking. The candle flickered, its flame growing taller, casting the room in a strange, golden light. A figure emerged from the darkness, a man, his face obscured by shadows, but his presence undeniable. You shouldn't have come, the man said, his voice filled with a chilling certainty. Lauren backed away, her breath coming in short gasps. What do you want? The figure stepped closer, and she could feel the weight of his gaze. It's not about what I want, he said. It's about what the house wants. The candle extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. Lauren's scream was swallowed by the darkness. She fumbled for the door, her fingers brushing the cold, unyielding wood. The air in the library grew heavy, pressing against her chest and making it hard to breathe. A faint glow began to emanate from the edges of the bookshelves, the spines of ancient tomes illuminating with an eerie, pulsating light. "Lauren," the voice whispered again, this time closer, almost directly in her ear. She spun around, her back pressed against the door. The shadowed figure had vanished, but the oppressive feeling of being watched lingered. The bookshelves began to shift, their wooden frames groaning as they slid apart like opening gates. Behind them, a narrow passageway emerged, its walls lined with flickering sconces. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a cacophony of disjointed voices. Lauren wanted to turn and run, but her feet refused to move. Her body felt disconnected from her mind, driven by an inexplicable force compelling her to step into the passage. With each step, the air grew colder, and the flickering light cast grotesque, shifting shadows on the walls. The passageway ended abruptly, opening into a cavernous chamber far larger than the dimensions of the house should have allowed. The floor was made of polished black stone, and in the center stood a massive, ornate mirror. Its frame was gilded, intricately carved with writhing figures that seemed to shift and twist when she looked too closely. Lauren approached the mirror, her reflection distorted and blurred. The whispers subsided, replaced by a low, rhythmic hum that resonated deep in her chest. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing the cold glass. The moment she touched it, the hum stopped, and the room was plunged into silence. Then, the mirror's surface rippled like water, and her distorted reflection began to shift. The face staring back at her was no longer her own. It was Eleanor's. "You've come far," the reflection said, its voice echoing through the chamber. "But the house has not yet shown you everything." Lauren stumbled back, her heart pounding. "What is this? What do you want from me?" The reflection smirked, its expression both familiar and alien. "The house is alive, Lauren. It breathes. It remembers. And it chose you because you are the last link to its true purpose." "I don't want any part of this," Lauren said, her voice trembling. "You have no choice," the reflection replied. "The house has waited too long. Its power has grown restless, and it needs an anchor, a blackthorn. You must accept the inheritance, or the house will take it by force." Lauren shook her head, backing away from the mirror. "I don't even know what that means." The reflection laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "You will." The mirror's surface rippled again, and the room around her began to shift. The polished stone floor cracked, and vines with thorns as sharp as daggers erupted from the ground, curling toward her like grasping hands. Lauren ran, her breath ragged as she dodged the thorny vines. The chamber twisted and morphed, the walls closing in and then expanding again in an endless, disorienting loop. She tripped and fell, the cold stone bruising her knees. As she scrambled to her feet, she noticed a door at the far end of the room, barely visible through the tangle of vines. With no other option, she sprinted toward it, the thorns tearing at her clothes and skin. When she reached the door, she threw it open and stumbled through, slamming it shut behind her. The whispers returned, softer now, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. Lauren found herself in a long corridor, its walls lined with faded portraits. The faces in the paintings were all eerily similar, their eyes following her as she moved. At the end of the corridor was another door, slightly ajar, with a warm light spilling out. She approached cautiously, peering inside. The room beyond was a parlor, its furnishings untouched by time. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Sitting in an armchair by the fire was Eleanor, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "You're beginning to understand," Eleanor said without looking up. Lauren stepped inside, her fists clenched. "No, I don't understand anything. What is this place? What does it want from me?" Eleanor gestured to the seat across from her. "Sit. You deserve answers." Reluctantly, Lauren sat down, her body tense. "The Blackthorn family has always been different," Eleanor began, her gaze fixed on the fire. "The house was not built by mortal hands. It was summoned, created as a vessel for something far older than you or me." "What do you mean, summoned?" Lauren asked. "This house exists at the edge of two worlds," Eleanor explained. "It is a gateway, a tether between the living and the dead. For generations, the Blackthorn family has served as its caretakers, its protectors. But the cost is high." Lauren frowned. "What cost?" Eleanor turned to her, her eyes dark and filled with sorrow. "The house feeds on us, on our memories, our emotions, our very souls. It grants power in return, but the price is steep. Each heir grows weaker until there is nothing left but the house itself. Then why not destroy it?" Lauren asked, her voice rising. Eleanor shook her head. "It cannot be destroyed. It is bound to our bloodline. That's why it chose you. You are the last Blackthorn, the only one who can continue the legacy." Lauren stood, shaking her head. "No, I won't do it. I won't let it take me." Eleanor rose slowly, her expression unreadable. "You don't understand. If you reject the house, it will not simply let you leave. It will consume you, piece by piece, until there is nothing left." The fire in the hearth flared, casting the room in an ominous glow. The walls began to shudder, and the air grew heavy with an oppressive force. "You must choose, Lauren," Eleanor said, her voice echoing with an otherworldly resonance. "Accept your place as the heir, or be devoured by the house." Lauren's mind raced, her instincts screaming at her to run, but she knew there was nowhere to go. The house was alive, and it wouldn't let her escape. As the room began to darken, she realized the choice wasn't just about survival. It was about power, about understanding the truth of what she had inherited. She had to decide. Lauren stood frozen, the weight of Eleanor's words pressing down on her like a heavy stone. The air in the parlor had grown colder, the shadows stretching and writhing as though alive. The fire in the hearth flickered wildly, casting distorted shapes onto the walls that seemed to sneer and whisper. "Choose, Lauren," Eleanor urged, her tone sharp yet oddly compassionate. "The house will not wait forever." Lauren's mind spun with questions and doubts. The idea of being tied to this monstrous place, of surrendering her life to its dark will, was unthinkable. Yet, the alternative, a slow, agonizing descent into nothingness, was equally horrifying. "What happens if I say yes?" Lauren asked, her voice trembling. Eleanor's gaze softened, but her expression was grim. "If you accept, the house will become a part of you, and you of it. It will grant you power, knowledge, and protection, but it will also take from you. Your memories, your freedom, your very sense of self will be eroded over time. You will exist as its anchor, its guardian, until it no longer has need of you. And if I refuse?" Lauren pressed. Eleanor looked away, her silence heavier than words. The fire dimmed, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. You've felt its pull, haven't you? Eleanor finally said. The house has already begun to claim you. If you reject it, it will turn on you. Slowly, at first. You'll lose pieces of yourself, your memories, your strength, your will. And then, when there's nothing left, it will devour you entirely. Lauren clenched her fists, anger and fear boiling inside her. Why me? Why does it have to be me? Eleanor's lips curled into a faint, sorrowful smile. Because you are the last. The bloodline ends with you. The house is bound to our family, and without an heir, its power will collapse. It's desperate, Lauren. That's why it called you here. The walls began to groan, the sound deep and resonant, like the grinding of ancient stone. The shadows grew darker, and the oppressive presence of the house became almost unbearable. You must decide now, Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the cacophony. Accept the inheritance or face the consequences. Lauren's chest tightened as the room seemed to close in around her. She glanced at the flickering fire, at the writhing shadows, at Eleanor's unyielding gaze. The weight of the choice bore down on her, suffocating and inescapable. Lauren began, her voice faltering. Before she could finish, the room shuddered violently, and the fire extinguished with a deafening roar. The darkness surged forward, enveloping everything in its path. Lauren stumbled backward, her pulse racing as the shadows consumed the parlor. You cannot run, the house whispered, its voice deep and guttural. You belong to me. Lauren's vision blurred, and her legs gave out beneath her. She fell to the floor, the cold stone sapping the warmth from her body. The shadows swirled around her, pulling her down into a void of endless black. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no light, no sense of time or space. Just an infinite, suffocating darkness. Then, a faint light appeared in the distance. It grew brighter, and with it came a sense of clarity, of understanding. Lauren found herself standing in the grand foyer of Blackthorn Manor, the house eerily still. Eleanor was gone, and the whispers had fallen silent. The air was heavy with anticipation, as though the house itself was waiting for her decision. She turned to the mirror at the base of the staircase, its surface shimmering like liquid silver. Her reflection stared back at her, but this time it was different. The face in the glass was older, wearier, with eyes that held secrets too heavy to bear. You must choose, the reflection said, its voice a perfect echo of her own. Lauren stepped closer, her fingers trembling as she touched the mirror. The surface rippled beneath her touch, and a wave of warmth surged through her. Images flashed before her eyes, memories of her childhood, her parents, her life before this moment. She saw glimpses of the house's history, its creation, its purpose. The mirror's voice softened, almost pleading. If you accept, you will have power beyond imagination. You will become one with the house, its protector and its prisoner. If you refuse, you will lose yourself, piece by piece, until there is nothing left. Tears welled in Lauren's eyes as the weight of the decision bore down on her. She thought of her life outside the house, of the people she loved, of the freedom she would be giving up. But she also thought of the darkness that would consume her if she refused. With a deep, shuddering breath, she made her choice. I accept, she whispered. The house groaned in response, a sound both triumphant and mournful. The mirror's surface shattered, and a blinding light engulfed her. When the light faded, Lauren stood in the grand foyer once more. The air was still, the house silent. She could feel its presence within her, a deep, pulsing connection that tied her to every stone, every shadow, every secret. She was no longer just Lauren Carter. She was the last Blackthorn, the heir to the house's legacy. And the house was alive. The stillness in Blackthorn Manor was deafening, broken only by Lauren's steady breathing. She stood motionless in the grand foyer, her hand hovering over the fractured mirror. Its surface, though shattered, still shimmered faintly, the remnants of its strange energy pulsing like a dying heartbeat. Her body felt different, heavier yet more attuned to the space around her. She could sense the house breathing, its walls expanding and contracting imperceptibly, as though relieved to have a new anchor. "What have I done?" Lauren whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. The answer came not in words, but in a rush of sensations. The house poured itself into her, memories, emotions, fragments of its history cascading through her mind like a torrent. She saw Eleanor as a young woman, standing before the same mirror, her face pale and resolute. She saw generations of Blackthorns, each succumbing to the house's will in their own time, their lives consumed piece by piece. And then she felt the power. It coursed through her veins, electric and undeniable. She raised her hand instinctively, and the shadows in the room responded, curling and writhing like living creatures awaiting her command. A cold thrill ran down her spine as she realized the extent of her new connection. The house was no longer just a structure. It was an extension of herself, a living entity bound to her will. But with that power came the weight of responsibility. Lauren could feel the house's hunger, a deep, insatiable need for more. Memories, emotions, life. It craved them all, and it was her role to feed it. The sound of distant footsteps broke her reverie. Lauren turned sharply, her senses heightened. Someone was in the house. She moved through the foyer, her steps eerily silent on the marble floor. The shadows around her stretched and shifted, lighting her path with a dim, flickering glow. She didn't need to speak to command them. The house understood her intentions now. The footsteps grew louder as she approached the dining hall, pushing the heavy wooden doors open. She found a man standing in the center of the room. He was dressed in a black coat, his face obscured by the low brim of a hat. "Who are you?" Lauren demanded, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. The man turned slowly, revealing sharp, piercing eyes that seemed to see through her. "So, you finally accepted it," he said, his tone calm and measured. "The house has been waiting for this moment." Lauren narrowed her eyes, her unease growing. "How do you know about the house?" The man smirked, removing his hat and bowing slightly. "I've been watching Blackthorn Manor for a long time. I'm a seeker of unique places like this, places where the veil between worlds is thin." She stepped closer, her instincts on high alert. "Why are you here?" "To make a proposition," the man replied, his eyes gleaming. "The house is powerful, yes, but it's incomplete. There are doors it cannot open, realms it cannot reach without assistance. I can help you unlock its full potential." Lauren hesitated, the house's whispers stirring in the back of her mind. It didn't trust him. Neither did she. "And what do you get out of this?" she asked. The man's smirk widened. "Let's just say I have a vested interest in what lies beyond those doors. A partnership would benefit us both." The shadows in the room thickened, coiling around Lauren protectively. She could feel the house's unease, its wariness of the man's presence. "I don't think the house likes you very much," Lauren said, her voice cold. The man chuckled, unfazed. "The house is a tool, nothing more. It serves you now, but remember, its loyalty is not unconditional. If you falter, it will find someone else." His words sent a chill through her. The house's whispers grew louder, urging her to act, to protect it from this intruder. Lauren raised her hand, and the shadows surged forward, wrapping around the man like serpents. He didn't resist, his expression calm as they tightened their grip. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice strained but composed. "You don't know the full extent of what you've inherited. You'll need me eventually." "Leave," Lauren commanded, her voice laced with newfound authority. The shadows dragged the man toward the doorway, his smirk never fading. "I'll be back," he said as the darkness consumed him, "when you're ready to see the truth." With a final burst of energy, the shadows hurled him out of the house. The door slammed shut, and the whispers subsided, leaving Lauren alone once more. She exhaled deeply, her hands shaking. The house hummed with approval, its presence wrapping around her like a cloak. For now, she had proven herself worthy. But the man's words lingered in her mind, a seed of doubt she couldn't shake. The house was alive, and it was hers. But at what cost? The silence in Blackthorn Manor was short-lived. The house seemed to exhale, the walls vibrating faintly as though satisfied with Lauren's decision to expel the stranger. But as the vibration subsided, a new sensation emerged, a pulse, rhythmic and slow, as if the house had a heartbeat. Lauren stood in the foyer, her senses heightened. She could feel the pulse not just in the walls, but in her own chest, resonating through her like an unseen tether. It was summoning her, urging her to explore deeper. "Show me," Lauren whispered, her voice trembling. The shadows stirred in response, stretching across the floor like ink spilling in water. They formed a path leading toward the east wing, a section of the manor she had never dared to explore. She hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the fractured mirror. Its shards reflected distorted fragments of the room, but in one piece of glass she saw movement, a fleeting image of Eleanor watching her. When Lauren turned, the figure was gone. Taking a deep breath, she followed the shadows. The east wing was colder, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. The ornate wallpaper peeled in long strips, revealing darkened, splintered wood beneath. Portraits lined the hallway, their subjects' faces obscured by time or something more deliberate. As Lauren moved deeper, the pulse grew stronger, the rhythmic thudding echoing in her ears. The house guided her to a set of double doors, their surface carved with intricate patterns of intertwining vines and thorns. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the brass handle. "Open it," the house whispered, its voice a low, insistent hum in her mind. The handle was cold beneath her touch. She turned it slowly, the door creaking open to reveal a vast chamber bathed in dim, flickering light. The floor was covered in a mosaic of dark stone, and the walls were lined with shelves that stretched impossibly high, filled with objects that seemed to hum with energy. Crystals, ancient tomes, and artifacts Lauren couldn't begin to identify. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and upon it rested a single object, a black key, its surface polished to an unnatural sheen. The pulse in the walls quickened as Lauren approached the pedestal. She could feel the key's power radiating, pulling her closer with an almost magnetic force. "This is what you've been hiding," Lauren murmured, reaching out. The moment her fingers touched the key, a wave of energy surged through her. Images flashed in her mind, fragments of the house's creation, of rituals performed by long-dead blackthorns, of a door hidden deep within the manor that the key was meant to unlock. She staggered backward, clutching the key tightly. The room seemed to shift around her, the shelves bending and warping as if the house itself was alive and reacting to her discovery. "What door?" she asked aloud, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. The house didn't answer, but the shadows on the walls twisted and stretched, forming the outline of a doorway. Lauren's heart pounded as she realized it wasn't just a vision, it was a map. With the key in hand, she followed the shadowy path, retracing her steps through the east wing and deeper into the manor. The house seemed to guide her now, its whispers growing more urgent. After what felt like hours, Lauren arrived at a hidden alcove behind a crumbling staircase. The pulse was deafening here, the air vibrating with energy. Before her stood the door. It was ancient, its surface carved with runes that glowed faintly in the dim light. The door seemed to breathe, the wood shifting as though alive. Lauren raised the key, her hands trembling. As she inserted it into the lock, the house fell silent, the pulse ceasing abruptly. The stillness was suffocating. She turned the key, and the door swung open with a low, guttural groan. Beyond it lay a spiral staircase, descending into darkness. A faint, otherworldly light glowed from below, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The house whispered again, its voice softer now, almost reverent. "This is the heart. You must see it." Lauren stepped onto the staircase, the stone cold beneath her feet. With each step, the light grew brighter, illuminating carvings on the walls, scenes of rituals, sacrifices, and the binding of the house to the Blackthorn bloodline. When she reached the bottom, she found herself in a circular chamber. At its center was a pool of liquid silver, its surface shimmering like molten metal. Hovering above the pool was a pulsating orb of light, its glow both beautiful and terrifying. Lauren could feel the power radiating from it, filling the chamber with a palpable energy. She knew instinctively that this was the heart of the house, the source of its power and its curse. "You are one with it now," the house whispered, "but there is more to learn." Lauren approached the pool, her reflection shimmering on its surface. The orb pulsed brighter as she drew near, its light enveloping her. The house's voice grew louder, echoing in her mind. "Will you bind yourself fully? Will you embrace the legacy and unlock the house's true potential?" Lauren hesitated, staring into the swirling depths of the pool. She thought of the stranger's warning, of Eleanor's sorrow, of the countless lives the house had consumed. But she also felt the power within her, the intoxicating pull of the house's energy. The choice lay before her once again, to submit fully and become the house's eternal anchor, or to resist and risk losing everything. As she reached out toward the orb, her decision would seal her fate. Lauren's fingers hovered over the pulsating orb, its light bathing her face in a silvery glow. The power radiating from it was overwhelming, a force that called to her deepest instincts. She could feel the house watching her, its presence heavy and expectant. "Embrace it," the house whispered, its voice weaving through her thoughts like smoke. "You are ready." The orb pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, a synchronization that felt almost intimate. Yet, Doubt clawed at the edges of her mind. What would happen if she surrendered completely? Would she still be Lauren, or just another vessel for the house's will? Her hesitation didn't go unnoticed. The shadows along the chamber walls began to rise, their movements sharp and restless. The house's whispers grew louder, more insistent. "You must decide," it urged. "The longer you delay, the weaker you become. This is your destiny." Lauren clenched her fists, her breath quickening. She thought of Eleanor, of the generations of blackthorns who had come before her. She thought of the stranger's warning, his cryptic offer of help. Most of all, she thought of the life she had left behind, a life she might never return to. "I need to know the truth," she said aloud, her voice trembling but resolute. "What is the house's purpose? Why does it need me?" For a moment, the chamber fell silent. Then, the orb began to shift, its light dimming as if considering her demand. The liquid silver in the pool swirled faster, its surface churning with flashes of light and shadow. The house responded, not with words, but with visions. Lauren's mind was flooded with images, ancient rituals performed by robed figures in the very chamber she now stood in, bloodlines meticulously maintained to preserve the house's connection to the living world. A portal, glowing with the same silvery light as the pool, opening to a realm beyond comprehension. She saw creatures, twisted, writhing forms, emerging from the portal, their grotesque shapes dissolving into the fabric of the house itself. They became the shadows, the whispers, the unseen forces that haunted every corner of Blackthorn Manor. The visions shifted, revealing the cost of the house's power. Each Blackthorn who had served as its anchor had slowly withered, their lives consumed by the endless demands of the house. They became part of it, their souls trapped within its walls, their voices joining the chorus of whispers. Lauren staggered back, her head spinning. "You're not just a house," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "You're a prison." The orb flared, its light blinding. The house's voice rose in anger, its whispers overlapping into a deafening roar. "I am more than that. I am a gateway, a bridge between worlds. Without me, the veil collapses and chaos reigns." Lauren shielded her eyes, the weight of the house's revelation pressing down on her. She understood now why the house was so desperate for an heir, why it had clung to her so fiercely. Without someone to maintain the bond, the forces it contained would break free, unleashing unimaginable horrors. But the cost of maintaining that balance was too high. She couldn't condemn herself to the same fate as Eleanor and the others. "There has to be another way," she said, her voice rising above the house's roar. The orb dimmed, its pulsing slowing as if considering her words. The shadows along the walls stilled, their restless movements ceasing. "Another way," the house repeated, its voice quieter now, almost contemplative. "There is no other way. The bond must be maintained." Lauren's gaze fell to the pool of liquid silver, its surface calming into a mirror-like stillness. She saw her reflection staring back at her, but behind it, she glimpsed something else, a faint, flickering light. It wasn't the house's light. It was hers. "I'm not just an anchor," she said, realization dawning. "I'm more than that. I can change this." The house's whispers surged in protest, but Lauren ignored them. She stepped closer to the pool, her reflection growing brighter with each step. The light within her expanded, pushing back the shadows, silencing the house's voice. She reached into the pool, the liquid silver cold and thick around her hand. The orb trembled, its glow faltering as Lauren's light grew stronger. "No," the house bellowed, its voice filled with fury and fear. "You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand enough," Lauren replied, her voice steady. With a final surge of energy, she pulled the orb into the pool, merging its light with her own. The chamber shook violently, the walls cracking as the house screamed in protest. The liquid silver erupted in a blinding wave, washing over Lauren and filling the room with an intense, radiant light. She felt the house's power coursing through her, not as a burden, but as a part of her. When the light faded, the chamber was still. The pool was gone, the orb extinguished. The shadows had receded, leaving the room bathed in a soft, natural glow. Lauren stood alone, her body humming with a quiet, steady power. The house was silent, its whispers replaced by a sense of calm. She had done it. She had broken the cycle. But as she ascended the spiral staircase and emerged into the grand foyer, she knew her journey wasn't over. Blackthorn Manor was still alive, still bound to her. But now it was hers to shape. For the first time, the house felt like home. Lauren stood in the grand foyer of Blackthorn Manor, the silence no longer oppressive but contemplative. The house was different now, quieter, subdued. Its once constant whispers were gone, replaced by a gentle hum that resonated through the walls and floors. She ran her hand along the banister of the grand staircase, its wood warm beneath her touch. The manor seemed to breathe with her, its energy flowing in harmony instead of conflict. For the first time, Lauren felt as though she were not merely a part of the house, but its equal. Still, unease lingered. The vision she had seen, the rituals, the sacrifices, the horrors tied to the house's legacy, had not disappeared with her newfound control. They were scars etched into the very fabric of the manor, reminders of the weight she now carried. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the front door. Lauren froze, her heart pounding. No one had approached the manor in weeks, not since she had first crossed its threshold and claimed her place within its walls. The knock came again, louder this time. She moved cautiously toward the door, her footsteps silent on the polished floor. The shadows along the walls stirred faintly, their movements subdued but watchful. The house was alert, as if sensing her unease. Reaching the door, she hesitated for a moment before pulling it open. On the doorstep stood the stranger she had cast out days ago. His dark coat was damp from the misty rain, his sharp eyes gleaming with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "I see you've made some changes," he said, his voice calm but edged with something Lauren couldn't place. "What do you want?" she asked, her grip tightening on the door. The man smirked, leaning casually against the doorframe. "To see how far you've come. The house feels different. It's no longer the ravenous beast it once was." "That's because it's not yours to judge," Lauren replied, her tone firm. "It's mine now." His smirk widened. "So it is. But ownership comes with responsibility. You've only scratched the surface of what this place can do." Lauren stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "I'm not interested in your games. Whatever you think you know, it doesn't matter anymore. The house is free from its curse." "Free?" The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You've silenced the whispers, yes, but freedom is an illusion. This house is still a gateway, and gateways attract attention. You'll find that out soon enough." Lauren's stomach tightened at his words. She had hoped breaking the house's cycle would sever its ties to the otherworldly forces that had plagued it for centuries. But the man's warning suggested otherwise. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease creeping into her chest. The man's expression turned serious. "You think you've closed the door, but you've only drawn attention to yourself. The power you wield now, it's a beacon. There are things out there that won't ignore it." Lauren's mind raced, the weight of his words settling over her. She had felt the house's energy change, had embraced the light within herself, but she hadn't considered the consequences beyond the manor's walls. "I can handle it," she said, more to herself than to him. The man studied her for a moment before nodding. "Maybe you can. But if you need help," he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, intricately carved box. "You know where to find me." He placed the box on the doorstep and turned to leave, disappearing into the mist without another word. Lauren stared after him, her thoughts swirling. She bent down and picked up the box, its surface cool and smooth beneath her fingers. The carvings depicted scenes similar to those she had seen in the house's visions. Portals, rituals, and figures caught between worlds. She opened it cautiously. Inside was a single piece of paper, blank except for an address scrawled in elegant handwriting. The shadows around her stirred again, their movements sharp and questioning. The house didn't trust the man, and neither did Lauren. But she couldn't deny the possibility that he was right. If the house was a gateway, then her role as its keeper was far from over. She closed the box and set it aside, her resolve hardening. Whatever came next, she would face it. Blackthorn Manor was no longer a place of fear. It was her home, her power, and her responsibility. As she ascended the staircase, the house's hum grew stronger, filling her with a sense of purpose. For the first time, she felt ready. The world beyond the house could wait. Tonight, the house was at peace, and so was she. For now. The night settled over Blackthorn Manor like a heavy blanket, the soft hum of the house growing more pronounced in the quiet. Lauren sat in the study, the only light in the room emanating from the crackling fireplace. She stared at the small box the stranger had left her, its intricate carvings still fresh in her mind. There was something unsettling about it, something that tugged at the corners of her thoughts. She had told herself that she didn't need his help, that she had everything under control. But deep down, a lingering doubt festered. The stranger had been right about one thing. The house had changed, but so had she. And with that change came responsibility, a burden she wasn't sure she was ready to carry. But the message was clear. The house was more than just a physical space. It was a living thing, a conduit to other realms, and there were forces watching, waiting for her to slip up. If she did, they would come. Her fingers traced the address on the paper, the ink almost glowing in the dim light. The urge to visit the location gnawed at her, but a voice deep inside told her to resist, to stay within the safety of the manor's walls. But safety, she realized, was an illusion. The house itself had never truly been safe, and now that it was hers, the dangers felt far more personal. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window panes, and the sound of rain against the glass grew louder, as if nature itself were conspiring against her. Lauren stood up, pacing the study, her mind racing. She needed to know more about the house, about the portal the stranger had warned her of. Before she could make up her mind, there was a soft knock at the door. Lauren froze, her heart skipping a beat. No one had come to visit since the stranger's departure. She hadn't even heard the footsteps approaching. She opened the door cautiously. half expecting to see the stranger standing there again. But it was someone else entirely. A woman, cloaked in a deep green shawl, stood on the threshold. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders in waves, and her eyes were an intense shade of amber, almost glowing in the dim light. There was something ethereal about her, something that made the room feel colder the moment she stepped inside. "I hope I'm not interrupting," the woman said. Her voice like a whisper carried on the wind. Lauren's pulse quickened. "Who are you?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. The woman's lips curved into a slight smile. "I'm someone who has been watching you, Lauren Blackthorne. We all have." A shiver ran down Lauren's spine. "Watching me? Who are you? What do you want?" The woman stepped further into the study, her presence unsettling, like the air had shifted with her arrival. She didn't answer right away, instead glancing around the room as if inspecting it, her eyes lingering on the objects in the study, the books lining the shelves, the paintings hanging on the walls. "I know what you've done," the woman finally said. "I know what you're becoming." Lauren narrowed her eyes. "I'm not becoming anything," she replied, her voice firm. "I've stopped the house's curse. I've broken the cycle. I'm in control now." The woman tilted her head, as if amused by Lauren's certainty. "You think you've broken it? You think it's that simple?" Lauren's breath caught. There was something in the woman's tone that felt like a warning. "No," the woman continued. "You've only begun to understand the truth. The house is not a simple thing. You can't control it like a mere object. It is a living entity, a creature of darkness, and you are its keeper now. Its power has already begun to change you, Lauren. It has awakened something inside you." "I don't need to hear this," Lauren snapped, backing away. She knew the woman was trying to provoke her, to make her doubt herself, but something in her words resonated. The changes she had felt, the power that flowed through her veins. Was it really her doing? Or was it the house manipulating her all along? "I didn't come here to frighten you," the woman said softly, her eyes gleaming. "I came because there are things far worse than the house itself. Things that will want to take advantage of the beacon you've become." "The beacon," Lauren whispered, her throat tightening. The woman nodded. "Yes. Your actions, your connection to the house, have drawn attention from forces beyond this world. They are watching, waiting for you to slip." Lauren swallowed hard. The air in the study felt thicker now, as if it were closing in on her. She wanted to run, to escape the suffocating presence of the woman before her, but she couldn't move. "What are you?" Lauren asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I am one of them," the woman replied, her smile widening. "One of the Watchers. And I am here to warn you, Lauren. There is a price to be paid for everything. The house's power does not come without a cost. And soon, you will see the true nature of the world you've just entered." The woman's words echoed in the room, a haunting promise of what was to come. Lauren felt the weight of them settle deep in her chest. "Get out," Lauren said, her voice shaking now. The woman didn't move. "You can't stop this, Lauren. Not alone." With a sudden motion, she turned and walked toward the door, pausing just before stepping outside. "But don't worry," she said, her voice low and almost kind. "There are others who will come to your aid, whether you want them to or not." And with that, she was gone, leaving Lauren standing in the darkened study, her heart racing in her chest. Outside, the wind howled, the rain battering the windows as if the very elements were responding to the woman's ominous words. The house groaned softly, the hum returning, but it felt different now. Darker, more foreboding. Lauren knew her life, and the life of Blackthorn Manor had just shifted into something far more dangerous. And the worst part was, she didn't know if she was ready to face it. The house seemed to hold its breath after the woman's departure, the oppressive silence hanging like a thick fog. Lauren stood motionless in the study, her thoughts a tangle of confusion and fear. The woman's warning echoed in her mind, growing louder with every passing second. "You can't stop this, Lauren. Not alone." The words reverberated through her chest, as though the house itself was repeating them. The hum, which had once felt like a comfort, now felt like a warning. She could almost hear the manor whispering, its walls creaking and groaning as though in agreement with a mysterious visitor. Lauren took a slow breath, trying to steady herself. She had broken the house's curse. She had felt the change, the shift in energy. But had she really freed herself from its hold, or had she only opened the door to something much darker? She had no answers, no clear direction. All she knew was that something was coming, and the house was calling to it. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling like a pack of wolves. Rain lashed against the windows, the sound filling the house like the beating of 1,000 wings. Lauren's eyes flickered toward the window, watching as the trees outside swayed violently, their limbs bending and cracking under the pressure of the storm. It was as though nature itself was reacting to the presence that now loomed over Blackthorn Manor. Then, a sound, a faint knock. Lauren's heart skipped a beat. Who could it be now? She had already dealt with one unexpected visitor, and she wasn't sure she was ready for another. Yet, she had no choice but to answer. With hesitant steps, she moved toward the door, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the handle. She didn't know what to expect, but a strange feeling prickled at the back of her neck. She wasn't alone. The house felt different, heavier. When she opened the door, she was met not by another person, but by a figure. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, standing in the dim light of the foyer. The figure was barely visible, its outline indistinct, like a wraith. For a moment, Lauren thought it was a trick of the light, or perhaps her mind playing tricks on her. But the longer she stared, the more real it became. The air around the figure shimmered, as though reality itself was bending. Lauren's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't see its face, but she could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on her chest. "I've been waiting for you," the figure spoke, its voice an eerie whisper, cold and timeless. Lauren's legs felt weak beneath her, but she managed to hold her ground. "Who are you?" Her voice cracked, betraying the fear that churned within her. The figure didn't respond immediately. It simply tilted its head, as if studying her, its movements slow and deliberate. Finally, it spoke again, its voice sending chills down her spine. "You are the keeper now," it said, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. "But there is more to your role than you understand." Lauren swallowed hard. "I know what I've done. I've broken the cycle." The figure's laugh was soft, almost mocking. "You've only begun to understand, little one. The house has been silent for far too long, but its hunger cannot be sated by your mere presence." The shadows around the figure seemed to stretch and grow, swirling like living things. Lauren took a step back, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She had felt the power of the house shift, had thought she understood it, but this was something entirely different. "What do you want?" Lauren whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure raised a hand, and the room seemed to darken. The shadows in the corners of the room twisted and stretched, responding to its command. "What I want," the figure said, "is for you to understand your true purpose. The house, it is not a sanctuary. It is not a place to hide. It is a prison, a gateway to a realm that has been waiting for its return. And you, Lauren, you are the key." Lauren's pulse quickened, her breath shallow. This wasn't the relief she had imagined. This wasn't the new beginning she had hoped for. The house had been a place of torment, of endless cycles, and now she had become a part of it. But to what end? The figure's form seemed to flicker and shift, its features no longer obscured by shadows, but replaced with something far worse. Its face was pale and gaunt, hollow eyes staring into hers with an unblinking intensity. The more she looked, the more Lauren realized that it was not human. The figure was something ancient, something otherworldly, and its gaze pierced through her like a blade. "You are the keeper, but you are also the prisoner," it said. "You will guard the house, protect it, and keep the gateway closed. But no matter how hard you try, you will never be free." Lauren felt the weight of its words settling in her chest like lead. She had thought she had control, that she had broken the cycle. But now she realized how wrong she had been. The house, the manor, the gateway, it was all connected, and she was trapped in the middle of it, bound by the very thing she had tried to escape. "You're wrong," Lauren said, her voice trembling but defiant. "I will not become like them. I will not let this place consume me." The figure smiled, a cold, empty grin. "You already are," it said softly. "You already are." And with that, it vanished into the shadows, leaving Lauren alone in the darkened foyer. The house seemed to pulse around her, its presence more alive than ever. The hum was louder now, a steady, unrelenting rhythm that echoed in her ears. Lauren knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The darkness was rising, and there was no escape. Lauren stood alone in the center of the grand foyer, the shadows stretching out around her, cold and alive. The figure's words echoed in her mind, relentless and unyielding. "You already are." The phrase twisted and turned, gnawing at her thoughts. Was it true? Had she truly become one with the house, or was she still clinging to the idea of escape, of freedom? The house felt heavier now, the air thick with a presence she couldn't name. The walls, once filled with whispers of the past, now seemed to hum with something darker, something ancient. The energy she had harnessed, the control she had believed she had, now felt fragile, as though it could snap at any moment. She turned toward the hallway, her gaze drawn to the portrait of her ancestors, faces frozen in time, their eyes staring down at her, lifeless but watchful. They had been the first to open the gateway, the first to bind themselves to the house. She had thought she was different, that she could break the cycle. But the figure, the one who had come to warn her, had made it clear that she was already part of it. The storm outside raged, its fury crashing against the windows with relentless force. The sound of wind howling and rain lashing against the glass was deafening, but it was nothing compared to the silence that had fallen over the house. The hum of the house had become a pulse, steady and slow, like the beating of a heart. It was no longer a distant sound. It was within her, intertwined with her every breath. Lauren closed her eyes, trying to center herself, trying to push back the panic that threatened to consume her. She had fought to break free. She had thought she could reclaim the house from its dark history. But the more she resisted, the more she realized that there was no escaping it. The house was her, and she was its keeper. "Is this my fate?" she whispered to the walls, her voice trembling in the silence. The house didn't respond, but she felt a strange warmth wash over her, as though it were trying to reassure her, to comfort her. She took a step forward, the weight of her new role sinking deeper into her soul. Just then, the front door creaked open behind her, the wind howling through the gap. She spun around, her heart leaping in her chest. Standing in the doorway was the stranger, the one who had warned her, the one who had left the small box. His face was obscured by the shadows, but she could feel his gaze, intense, knowing. "I knew you would come," Lauren said, her voice barely above a whisper. The stranger stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. His presence filled the room, and yet he seemed strangely out of place, as though he didn't belong in this world at all. "You're too late," Lauren said, her voice hardening. "The house is mine now. I have accepted my fate." The stranger's eyes softened as he approached her. "You haven't accepted anything, Lauren. You're just being consumed by it." Lauren felt a flash of anger surge within her, but she pushed it down. She had come so far. She had learned to control the house. She had broken the cycle. But did she really? "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her fists clenched at her sides. The stranger studied her with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. "I want to help you, but you have to realize that this house is not just a place. It's a prison, a gateway to something far worse than you've seen. You've done what you could to stop it, but the forces that linger here, they won't let you go so easily." Lauren took a step back, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What are you talking about?" The stranger's expression grew grave. "There are things within these walls that have been waiting for the right moment to escape. And you," he pointed a finger at her chest, "you are the key. You opened the door. Now you must make a choice." Lauren's heart pounded in her chest. She felt the weight of his words, the truth behind them pressing down on her. The house had been dormant for years, but something had been stirred. The house was a gateway, and now it had an insatiable hunger. "What choice?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Leave," the stranger said, his voice barely a whisper. "Leave before it's too late. Leave or become part of it forever." Lauren swallowed hard, her mind racing. The house had changed her. It had filled her with power, but it had also bound her to it. She was its keeper, its protector. But what if that was the very thing that condemned her? "What if I can't leave?" she asked, the fear creeping into her voice. "What if I'm already too far gone?" The stranger stepped closer, his face now illuminated by the flickering light of the fireplace. "Then you will face the consequences. The house will claim you, and there will be no turning back. The power you feel now, it will consume you, and you will be just another part of its endless cycle." Lauren stared at him, the weight of his words sinking into her. She had thought she was free. She had thought she could break the curse, but now it seemed she had only replaced one prison with another. The hum of the house grew louder, more insistent, and Lauren could feel the walls closing in on her. She had thought she could control it, but the house wasn't something to be controlled, it was something to be feared. "Please," the stranger said, his voice pleading now. have to choose." Lauren stood motionless, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. The house had claimed her, and in return, it had given her power. But at what cost? She took one final look at the stranger, then turned toward the door. As she stepped outside, the storm swallowed her whole. The wind howled, the rain pouring down in sheets, but Lauren didn't look back. She couldn't. The house had been her prison, and now it was time to let it go. As the door to Blackthorn Manor closed behind her, the last thing Lauren heard was the hum, the haunting, unrelenting hum, fading into the distance. And with that, Blackthorn Manor was silent once again. The end. Now the next tale. The echoes of Hollow Creek. In the heart of an isolated valley, surrounded by ancient trees and jagged cliffs, there stood a forgotten town known as Hollow Creek. Hidden from most maps and untouched by time, it existed in a world of its own, a place where nothing seemed to change, but everything was off-kilter. The town was cradled by an eerie silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves or the occasional crow's call from the nearby woods. To the outside world, it was a ghost town, abandoned, cursed, and shrouded in mystery. Yet, somehow, people still lived there. Amelia Foster had never heard of Hollow Creek. She was just passing through when her car broke down on a rainy night, far from any major highway. The storm had come on fast, and the dark, slick roads offered no sign of civilization, no markers of towns ahead. The headlights of her car cut through the gloom, but the rain blurred her vision, making it impossible to see beyond the windshield. When the engine sputtered and died, she cursed under her breath. She had no choice but to pull over and wait for help. The rain was relentless, falling in sheets, drenching her to the bone within minutes. Amelia grabbed her jacket, pulled it tighter around her, and stepped out into the downpour. She squinted into the storm, hoping to spot a farmhouse or any building that could offer shelter. To her surprise, she saw lights in the distance, dim but steady. There, at the foot of a hill, was Hollow Creek. The town, with its crumbling houses and overgrown streets, stood like a forgotten relic. Amelia hesitated, her instincts telling her to turn back, but the storm had taken a toll, and she was desperate for shelter. With no other choice, she made her way toward the town, her footsteps crunching on the wet gravel road. The air felt thick, heavy with moisture and something darker, something oppressive. The closer she got, the more unsettling the town seemed. The houses were decaying, their windows dark, their doors hanging ajar as if they had been abandoned in haste. Yet there was a strange sort of order to it all, like a place that had been frozen in time, untouched by the chaos of the world beyond its borders. Amelia reached the first building, a once grand home, now reduced to ruin. The door creaked open as if inviting her inside, and against her better judgment, she stepped into the darkness. The floorboards groaned beneath her feet, and a chill ran down her spine. The interior was musty, the air stale, but it was shelter from the rain. She could hear the howling wind outside, the sound of the storm battering the fragile walls. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely more than a whisper in the heavy air. No response. She strained her ears but heard nothing, only the relentless pounding of the rain. She was alone, or so it seemed. She moved deeper into the house, her flashlight beam dancing over the walls, illuminating peeling wallpaper and shattered furniture. The place had been abandoned for years, perhaps decades, but it still had an unnerving feeling of being watched. Suddenly, she heard a sound, a faint scraping, like nails on wood, coming from upstairs. Amelia froze, her heart leaping in her chest. She turned off the flashlight, straining to hear. The sound came again, louder this time, a slow, dragging noise that sent a ripple of fear through her. Maybe it was just an animal, she thought. Perhaps a rat or a raccoon had gotten inside. But the scraping continued. Closer. Amelia swallowed hard, her palms sweaty against the cold, wet flashlight. She had to investigate. If there was anyone in this house, anyone at all, they would surely be able to help her with her car. With shaky breaths, she made her way toward the staircase. The wooden steps creaked underfoot, and with each step, the scratching grew louder, more distinct. Her skin tingled with the sensation of being followed. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before her, dark and unwelcoming. The sound came from the last door on the left, ajar, as though it had been waiting for her. Amelia hesitated, her breath coming in shallow gasps. But she pressed on. Pushing the door open, she stepped into the room. The walls were lined with old furniture, all draped in dust-covered sheets. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and in the far corner of the room stood a large antique mirror. Its surface was clouded, tarnished with age, but as Amelia approached, she saw something in the reflection, a shape, a figure. Amelia gasped, stumbling back. The figure was dark, obscured by the fogged mirror, but its outline was unmistakable. A person, a shadow. It was hard to tell, but it was there, standing perfectly still. Her hand trembled as she reached for the mirror, wiping away some of the condensation with her sleeve. As the fog cleared, the shape remained. It was a woman, her face pale, her eyes wide and empty, her mouth slightly open as if in a silent scream. But there was no sound. "Hello," Amelia said again, her voice cracking. She reached out toward the mirror, her fingers brushing the cool surface. Suddenly, the figure in the mirror shifted, its head tilted at an impossible angle, and its eyes locked onto Amelia's, staring into her soul with an intensity that sent a chill through her body. She gasped and stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure remained in place, its hollow eyes never leaving her. The room felt colder now, the air thick with an unsettling pressure. She could hear the scratching noise again, but this time it wasn't coming from upstairs. It was behind her. Amelia turned quickly, her breath catching in her throat. The door she had entered through was now closed, the hallway outside bathed in complete darkness. She was trapped. Suddenly, the mirror behind her rattled, the glass shaking as if something on the other side was trying to break free. Amelia's pulse raced. She needed to get out of here. She turned to leave, but the room seemed to stretch impossibly long. The door was further away than before, the hallway too dark to see anything beyond it. Her vision blurred as the walls seemed to close in. She backed toward the door, only to find that it wasn't a door at all. It was just more walls, and the figure in the mirror was no longer there. Then, the scratching noise came again, louder this time, like claws dragging across the floor. It was coming from all sides. Amelia's breath came in quick, panicked gasps. The room was closing in on her. The shadows danced, forming shapes she couldn't quite make out, shapes that reached for her with ghostly fingers. Her body trembled with fear, but she refused to give in. She had to escape. The walls seemed to pulse, like they were alive, but then silence. A new voice, soft and whispering, brushed against her ear. "Stay with us, Amelia. Stay forever." Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. her breath ragged, as she spun around to find the source of the whisper. The room seemed to close in on her, the air thick with the scent of decay and mildew, but there was no one there. No figure, no voice. Just the echo of that haunting whisper still lingering in her mind. "Stay with us, Amelia." The words repeated, faint but insistent, like the pull of something far deeper than the house itself. Her instincts screamed at her to flee, but her legs felt as if they were rooted to the spot. She stumbled back, her foot hitting the crumbling floorboards. The wood groaned beneath her, and for a split second, she could have sworn the floor moved, as though the house itself was breathing. The scratching sound from before, faint at first, returned, now sharp and frantic. The noise seemed to come from everywhere, from beneath the floorboards, from the walls, even from the ceiling. The once still shadows in the room twisted, forming distorted shapes that moved in ways they shouldn't have. Amelia's stomach churned with a gnawing sense of dread. She had to get out. She didn't know what was happening, but she couldn't stay here any longer. She turned toward the door, her breath catching in her throat when she saw that it was no longer the doorway she had entered through. It was a wall, solid, cold stone. The door, the hallway, everything had vanished. She was trapped. She took a shaky step back, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold surface of the wall. The stone was smooth but strange, like it had been carved from something far older than the house itself. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scratched and worn into the stone, as though they had been etched over centuries. Then, as if the wall itself had heard her thoughts, it shifted. Slowly, imperceptibly, the stone began to move, creaking and groaning like a massive weight being lifted. The symbols began to glow faintly, casting an eerie light across the room, revealing more of the house's terrible history. The floor beneath her shifted with a sudden, violent lurch, and the ground cracked open like the earth itself was splitting. Amelia gasped, her feet stumbling backward as the dark hole widened. The shadows spilled out, swirling around her like a tide, cold and suffocating. "No, no," Amelia whispered, her voice trembling. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Panic overwhelmed her, and for a moment, she was paralyzed with fear. The hole in the floor seemed to beckon, its edges flickering with a pale, sickly light, like something was waiting for her. Out of the darkness, a figure emerged. A woman, pale, gaunt, with hollow, empty eyes that stared straight through her. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Instead, a cold breeze gusted through the room, carrying with it an unbearable weight, as if the figure itself had been trapped here for too long. Amelia felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow, of something deeply tragic, as if this woman had been lost to time, forever bound to the house. Before Amelia could react, the figure lunged, moving with a speed that defied the laws of nature. But it wasn't a physical lunge. It was as though the very air between them had stretched and snapped, propelling the woman forward in an instant. Amelia barely managed to stumble back in time, her heart racing. The figure's hand reached out, her fingers just inches away from Amelia's face. But then, the room shifted again. The walls groaned, the floor trembled, and the figure dissolved into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. For a moment, all was still. The cold air hung heavy around her, the silence almost unbearable. The symbols on the walls flickered and faded, and the stone wall, once a barrier, seemed to settle back into place, as though nothing had happened. But Amelia knew better. Something had changed. The house was alive. She needed to get out. Without thinking, Amelia rushed toward the last place she had seen the door. She reached the wall, her fingers frantically running over the cold surface, but it was no use. The door was gone. The house had swallowed it whole. There was no way out. Her breath hitched in her throat, panic beginning to rise again. She was trapped, completely, utterly trapped. And then she heard it again, the scratching. This time, louder, more urgent, closer. It was coming from behind her, from the shadows in the corner of the room. She whipped around, heart thundering in her chest, but there was nothing there, except the mirror. The mirror was no longer empty. Amelia's eyes widened as she saw a figure standing in the reflection. The same woman, but this time she was smiling. Her mouth stretched unnaturally wide, her teeth jagged and sharp like broken glass. Her eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, and she leaned closer to the mirror, as if whispering something to Amelia. A voice echoed in her mind, soft, almost soothing, but twisted with a strange hypnotic undertone. Stay with me. Forever. Amelia took a step back, her hand reaching out toward the mirror, but she pulled away just before her fingers touched the cold glass. The woman in the mirror leaned forward even more, her grin widening, her face distorting into something monstrous. The air in the room grew thick, and the temperature dropped several degrees. Amelia staggered back, her mind racing. This wasn't just a hallucination. This wasn't just fear. Something was reaching out to her, pulling her in. Before she could react, the mirror shattered, its fragments flying in every direction, and in the chaos, the woman's figure surged forward, her face a grotesque mask of hunger. The pieces of the mirror seemed to twist in the air, gathering around her like shards of glass, sharpening, cutting into the air, but somehow they never touched the floor. Amelia screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the deafening sound of the storm outside. Now a furious, raging tempest. The room seemed to pulse, the air growing heavy and thick, as though the house itself was alive with a force that could devour her whole. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from the far side of the room, and the floor gave way beneath her. She fell, the ground vanishing beneath her feet, and for a brief moment, all was darkness. She crashed onto something soft, her body jolting with the impact. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the house. She was in a vast, endless forest, surrounded by ancient trees, and in the distance, she could see a light that beckoned her. Amelia's pulse raced as she stood, her legs weak beneath her. The forest stretched out before her, and though the light seemed to offer safety, a deep unease settled in her chest. The whisper returned. "Come closer. We are waiting." Amelia's mind raced as she stood in the shadow of the towering trees, their twisted limbs stretching out like gnarled fingers, reaching toward her. The forest seemed alive. Its very essence pulsed with an eerie energy that wrapped around her like a suffocating fog. The light in the distance, flickering through the dense canopy, was her only guide, beckoning her forward. But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. She wasn't in the same place anymore. The cold, oppressive walls of the house had given way to the unsettling calm of the forest. The heavy scent of decay still lingered in the air, but here it was mingled with the scent of wet earth and moss. Taking a step forward, Amelia's boots sank into the soft, damp soil. The ground beneath her feet felt like it was shifting, as though the earth itself was unstable, like the very land was unstable, caught between two worlds. Her every movement echoed in the unnatural silence that surrounded her. Even the storm that had raged outside the house had disappeared, leaving behind only the wind whispering through the trees. The light beckoned her forward. Amelia's pulse quickened. She should turn back. She should run. But something in her, the same voice that had whispered to her in the house, urged her onward. She couldn't resist. The light promised answers. It promised freedom, and she needed that more than anything now. The trees seemed to close in around her as she ventured deeper into the forest, their trunks tall and shadowed, their branches like outstretched hands trying to pull her in. Every time she looked over her shoulder, she saw only more darkness. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, that there were eyes watching her from the depths of the trees. The light grew brighter as she moved forward, a strange glow that seemed unnatural, like something not of this world. It danced in her periphery, but when she focused on it, it flickered, almost as though it were trying to remain just out of reach. With each step, it seemed to draw her deeper into the forest. Her thoughts clouded with confusion and dread, and the whisper returned, curling around her mind like a cold, unshakable hand. Come closer. You're so close, Amelia. We've been waiting. Amelia gritted her teeth, shaking her head to banish the voice. But it wouldn't leave her. The words, so soft and insistent, echoed in the back of her mind like a drumbeat. She was close, too close now to turn back. Her legs ached, but she kept moving. The light was just ahead. She could feel it in her bones. The ground beneath her seemed to tremble, as though the entire forest was alive. The trees swayed, their branches creaking in a rhythm that was too deliberate to be natural. It wasn't wind. She could feel the air around her change, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then a sound, soft at first, then growing louder, filling the air with an eerie, rhythmic thumping. A heartbeat. A sound that wasn't hers but seemed to come from the earth itself. Amelia froze, her blood running cold. She had heard this sound before, back in the house, in the mirror, when the walls began to pulse. The thumping grew louder. The light ahead flared, brighter now, blinding in its intensity. But even through the light, Amelia could see something moving, shifting in the shadows at the edges of her vision. Something was coming. Her heart raced. She wanted to turn and run, but her legs refused to obey. She was rooted to the spot, her body trembling with fear. The whisper grew louder, and Amelia could feel her mind beginning to unravel. Closer. Just a little closer, Amelia. Don't you see? You belong to us now. The voice was no longer a whisper, but a command, a pull that seemed to draw her forward against her will. She was losing herself in the sound, in the light, in the presence that surrounded her. And then the shadows moved. A figure stepped from the darkness between the trees, emerging slowly, its shape barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, its movements jerky, unnatural. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, its body wrapped in tattered cloth. But Amelia could see its hands, pale, long, and bony, reaching out toward her. Something inside her snapped. The voice, the light, the pull, they all became too much. Amelia had to fight back. She couldn't let whatever this was consume her. With every ounce of strength she had left, Amelia ran. She sprinted toward the light, her breath ragged, her body screaming in protest, but she didn't stop. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift with each step, trying to trip her, to drag her down, but she pushed through. She had to escape. The light was so close now. She could see it clearly. A glowing figure standing in the middle of a clearing, its form shimmering like a mirage. The figure was tall and shadowed, its face obscured by a veil of light. The figure lifted one hand, and a voice, cold, distant, and familiar, echoed from the darkness around her. "Amelia, you've come so far. You don't know what you've done." Amelia's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the voice. It was the same voice that had whispered to her in the house, that had called to her from the mirror. It was a voice she had heard before, in the depths of her memory, buried beneath years of forgotten dreams. But now it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream. The light surged, blinding her, and for a split second, Amelia saw it. The true form of the figure, twisted, contorted, with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched wide in an eternal scream. "No!" Amelia screamed, her voice breaking through the suffocating silence. She turned to flee, but the ground beneath her feet collapsed, and she was falling. The light and the figure, the trees and the forest, all vanished in an instant. For a moment, there was only darkness, and then the cold. She was back in the house, no longer in the forest, no longer under the pull of the light. The walls were closing in around her again, and the whispering voices returned. But this time, they were no longer just whispers. They were everywhere. They were inside her. "Amelia, it's too late. You're one of us now." The floorboards groaned beneath her. The walls seemed to move in on her, and the air grew thick with an overwhelming pressure. Her body trembled as she tried to stand, but her legs felt weak, as if she were sinking into the floor itself. "Stay with us," the voices urged, the words like a chant, growing louder and louder until they were all she could hear. She was trapped, and the house, it seemed, was waiting for her to join the others who had come before her, waiting for her to become part of the darkness that had claimed Hollow Creek. And now there was no way out. Amelia could feel the darkness closing in around her, the weight of the house pressing down on her shoulders. The walls creaked and groaned, as if they were alive, shifting and twisting in ways they shouldn't. The whispers were louder now, filling her ears, crawling into her mind like an infection. She couldn't escape them. They seemed to seep from every crack in the walls, from the floor beneath her, from the very air she breathed. "Stay with us, Amelia. You're one of us now," the voices, hollow and distorted, repeated the same chilling message, pulling at her mind like tendrils of despair. She stumbled backward, her heart racing as her pulse thrummed in her ears. She had to get out. She had to find a way to break free from the grip of the house, but each step felt like she was sinking deeper into its hold. The floor beneath her feet felt unstable, as if it were constantly shifting, trying to swallow her whole. Her hand brushed against the wall, and the moment her skin made contact with the cold, damp surface, a jolt of electricity shot through her body. The sensation was both painful and mesmerizing, as though the house itself was reaching out to touch her, to claim her. She pulled her hand away, gasping for breath, her mind racing as the temperature in the room plummeted. The shadows around her seemed to grow darker, more oppressive, as if they were alive, watching her, waiting for her to break. She tried to steady her breathing, but the very air felt heavy, suffocating. The whispers grew louder, drowning out her thoughts, urging her to listen. "Come closer. You've always belonged here." Amelia shook her head, trying to block out the words, but they clawed at her mind, relentless and unyielding. She was trapped. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many others before her. There was no escaping it, no way out. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet trembled again, more violently this time, and she stumbled, nearly losing her balance. The air grew thick with an unbearable pressure, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire house was alive, its heart beating in time with hers, its pulse quickening as it drew her closer to whatever fate awaited her within its walls. From the darkness, a figure appeared, a shadowy silhouette, standing in the doorway at the far end of the hallway. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its form seemed to shift and contort with every blink. Amelia could barely make out its features, but she could feel its presence, cold, empty, like an abyss waiting to swallow her whole. She backed away, her breath coming in shallow gasps, but the figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching her, waiting. The more she stared at it, the more it seemed to grow, as if it were reaching out toward her, stretching its dark limbs to consume her. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had to run. She had to get away from this thing, whatever it was. But her legs felt like lead, and her body refused to obey. She was frozen, trapped in place, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figure in the doorway grew closer, its outline becoming clearer, revealing more of its twisted form. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath a hood of shadows, but its eyes were unmistakable. They glowed with an unnatural light, cold and empty, like two burning coals in the dark. The voice returned, this time louder, more urgent, as if the figure was speaking directly into her mind. You can't escape. You never could. You've always belonged to this house. We've been waiting for you. Amelia's stomach churned, and her pulse quickened. She wanted to scream, to run, but the words froze in her throat. The air around her was thick with the smell of decay, of something ancient and decayed. She could almost taste the bitterness in the air. She had to fight. She had to break free. But as she reached out, her hand trembling toward the door, the figure stepped forward, its shadow stretching across the room like a living thing. It was upon her in an instant, moving with a speed that defied logic. It reached out with long, claw-like fingers, and before she could react, one of its hands closed around her wrist. The grip was cold, unnaturally cold, and as the figure's fingers dug into her skin, Amelia felt her strength draining away. She tried to pull away, but the more she struggled, the tighter its grip became. The whispers grew louder, their words like nails scratching at the inside of her skull. Stay with us, Amelia, forever. In that moment, Amelia understood. She wasn't just trapped in the house. She was a part of it. A part of the thing that had been waiting for her for so long. The house was alive, and it had been watching, waiting for the right moment to claim her, just as it had claimed so many before her. The figure in the doorway stepped closer, and Amelia could see it more clearly now. Its face twisted and disfigured, its skin like rotting flesh, its eyes burning with an unholy light. It was one of them, one of the lost souls that had been consumed by the house. And now, it was time for Amelia to join them. She screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. The walls around her closed in, the shadows wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was the figure's mouth opening, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Welcome home, Amelia. Amelia's world was plunged into a suffocating blackness, her body immobilized by the grip of the shadowy figure. It felt as though time itself had stopped, the air around her thick with the stench of decay and rot. Her mind screamed, but her body refused to move, trapped in the vice-like grip of the house. The shadows swirled, twisting around her as the figure's fingers dug deeper into her wrist. The cold was unbearable, an unnatural cold that gnawed at her bones, seeping into her very soul. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The darkness pressed in on all sides, suffocating her, and yet she could hear the whispers, louder now, sharper, echoing from every corner of the room. "You are ours," they hissed. "You are part of us now. Welcome home." The words drilled into her skull, relentless and unyielding. Her body trembled, her pulse racing as she tried to break free, but the more she fought, the tighter the grip became. She could feel herself sinking into the very floor, her body being swallowed whole by the oppressive darkness that filled the room. But then, something changed. A sound, distant at first, but growing louder. A low, echoing hum, like a distant song that carried through the walls of the house. It was a familiar sound, though she couldn't place it. It filled her mind, drowning out the whispers, giving her a fleeting moment of clarity. The house seemed to tremble in response, as though the sound was an intruder, something that shouldn't be there. The grip on her wrist loosened, just for a moment, and in that instant, Amelia gathered every ounce of strength she had left. With a cry of desperation, she yanked her arm free from the figure's grasp. The world around her snapped back into focus. She was no longer in the suffocating darkness of the room. The cold air was replaced by a sudden warmth, the oppressive pressure of the house lifting, just for a moment. She ran. Her feet moved before her mind could catch up, and she sprinted through the hallway, the walls on either side seeming to close in around her. The house was alive, but now it seemed to be fighting her, resisting her every step. The floorboards beneath her feet groaned and shifted, as if trying to pull her down. But she kept running, faster, harder, her breath ragged in her chest. The house itself seemed to shift around her, the once familiar hallways twisting and turning in impossible directions. Rooms that should have been at the end of the corridor were now behind her, and doors that had once led outside were now sealed shut, as though they had never been there to begin with. The windows, too, were gone, leaving only the oppressive, darkened walls. The house was changing, warping, becoming something other than it had been. Amelia didn't know how long she had been running, or how far. Her legs burned with exhaustion, but the fear that gnawed at her heels kept her moving. The whispers had returned, louder now, their voices overlapping each other, a cacophony of madness and despair. "Turn back. It's too late for you. You'll never leave." She could hear the figure's footsteps behind her now, quick and purposeful, following her through the twisting halls. It wasn't alone. There were others. The sound of footsteps multiplied, and Amelia knew that they were coming for her. She reached a door that she didn't remember seeing before. It was old, the wood splintered and cracked, but there was something about it that felt different from the rest. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling as she grasped it. But before she could open it, the door swung open by itself. A gust of cold air rushed out, sending a shiver down her spine. She didn't hesitate. She stepped through the doorway, hoping it was an escape. The moment she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her, cutting off any escape. She spun around, her heart in her throat, but the room she had entered was unlike anything she had ever seen. It was a large chamber, circular in shape, with no windows, no doors. The walls were covered in symbols, arcane and twisted, carved deep into the stone. The ceiling above her was high, too high to see, but it was covered in dark stains, something that looked like dried blood. In the center of the room was a stone altar, weathered and cracked with age. It was covered in what appeared to be ancient runes, glowing faintly in the dim light. And on the altar, there was something else. A figure. A person, or at least, it had once been a person. The body was emaciated, its skin stretched taut over bone, its eyes hollow and dark, its mouth twisted into a silent scream. It was as though the person had been consumed, their body drained of life, left only as an empty shell. Amelia's stomach lurched, and she stepped back, only to find that the walls seemed to move with her, closing in, the symbols on them shifting, changing. The ground beneath her feet trembled, as though the very foundation of the house was beginning to break apart. The whispers were louder now, deafening. They were everywhere, crawling inside her mind, urging her to approach the altar. Come closer, they beckoned. You must know the truth. You have to understand. Amelia could feel her mind slipping, the weight of the house bearing down on her once more. But she had come too far. She couldn't give up now. With trembling hands, she approached the altar. The closer she got, the more the symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold stone of the altar. And then, something happened. The room seemed to shift. The walls crumbled away, the floor fell beneath her, and she was falling into an abyss that stretched endlessly before her. She screamed as she tumbled into the dark, the whispering voices swirling around her, their words growing frantic, desperate. You should never have come here, Amelia. You've sealed your fate. And then there was silence. Amelia's eyes snapped open. She was no longer in the chamber. She was back in the house, standing in the hallway once more. The walls were intact, the floor beneath her solid, but everything had changed. The house no longer felt like a place of mystery. It felt like a prison. The door at the end of the hallway was wide open now, and through it, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. In the distance, through the doorway, the outside world seemed to be gone. There was nothing but darkness, stretching infinitely in every direction. The sky was an oppressive shade of black, and the ground had crumbled into nothingness. The house was the only thing left, and she was trapped in it, forever. Amelia's breath caught in her throat as she gazed into the abyss that had once been the outside world. There was no sky, no stars, no moon, only an endless, choking void that pressed in on her from all sides. The house, once a place she believed she could escape, was now a tomb. She could feel the weight of its walls closing in, as though they were alive, breathing, watching her every move. The whispers were back, louder than ever, their cold, insistent voices echoing in her mind. Stay. You belong here. You cannot leave. Her heart pounded in her chest, the rhythm of her pulse matching the eerie hum that filled the house, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the very foundation of the building. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as though they were alive, feeding on her fear. The air was thick, and she could taste the metallic tang of dread on her tongue. Amelia stepped back from the door, her hands trembling as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The house had changed. What had once been a maze of winding corridors and hidden rooms now felt like a singular, oppressive force, pressing in on her, cutting off any path of escape. The air felt heavier with each passing moment, and the whispers were becoming louder, more insistent. You cannot escape. You are one of us now." The voice was so close, so unmistakable, that Amelia spun around, searching for the source. But the hallway was empty. There was no figure, no shape to be seen, only shadows that flickered and danced in the corners of her vision, as though they were alive. Her mind raced. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't be a part of whatever this place was. She needed to leave. She needed to find a way out. But how? The door was no longer an option. The world beyond it had vanished. There was nothing left but darkness. As she stood frozen in the hallway, a thought began to form in her mind, a realization cold and terrifying. The house was not just a building. It was a living entity, a consciousness that had been waiting for her, calling to her, drawing her in. Every room, every shadow, every creak of the floorboards. It was all part of something much larger, much darker than she could comprehend. The house was not a place to find refuge. It was a prison, a trap, and she was its latest victim. Her mind began to unravel as the weight of the truth settled in. She was not the first to fall into the house's grasp. There had been others, countless others, all lost to its depths, their souls consumed by its insatiable hunger. She could feel their presence now, the ghosts of the lost, their tormented wails filling the air around her. "They're watching you," the whispers taunted, growing louder with each passing second. "They never leave. They are part of the house now." The walls seemed to close in, the darkness pressing tighter and tighter until it felt as though it were suffocating her. Her pulse raced, panic rising in her chest. She had to do something. She had to get out of here before she, too, became a part of the house. But as she turned to flee, a door at the end of the hallway creaked open, a sliver of light spilling out into the darkness. Without thinking, she rushed toward the door, her feet pounding against the floor as she ran. The light was her only hope, the only thing that seemed to offer any chance of escape from this nightmare. The door loomed ahead, closer with every step, but the whispers grew louder, more frantic, urging her to stop. "Don't go. You can't escape. We will find you." Her breath came in ragged gasps as she reached the door. She flung it open, only to find a room that seemed impossibly large, a space that stretched out in all directions, an endless void of nothingness. There were no walls, no ceiling, no floor, only a black expanse that stretched on forever. She felt herself falling, her feet losing contact with the ground, her body tumbling into the abyss. But she didn't land. There was no impact, no ground to stop her fall. She was floating in a void, her body suspended in darkness, her mind reeling with terror. The whispers surrounded her, their voices growing louder, their presence pressing in on her from all sides. "You cannot run. You cannot hide. You belong to us now." Her chest tightened, her heart pounding in her ears. She could feel herself being pulled, dragged through the darkness, though there was no sense of direction, no sense of time. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the whispers seemed to wrap themselves around her, suffocating her. Suddenly, the darkness shifted, and a figure emerged from the void. It was tall, looming, its form shifting and distorting as though it were made of smoke, a shadow that flickered and twisted with every movement. Its face was a hollow void, empty and featureless, save for two burning eyes that glowed like embers in the darkness. Amelia, the figure intoned, its voice deep and hollow, like the echo of 1,000 souls. "You were chosen." The words sent a shock through her, the weight of them sinking deep into her chest. Chosen. What did it mean? chosen for what? The figure stepped closer, its form stretching impossibly long, its arms reaching toward her with fingers that seemed to melt into the darkness. She could feel its presence, cold and oppressive, suffocating her every breath. "You are part of this place now," it whispered, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "There is no escape. There never was." Amelia's mind screamed, her thoughts swirling in a frenzy, but her body refused to move. She couldn't escape. She couldn't fight. The house had already claimed her, and now it was coming for her, pulling her into the depths of its dark, unyielding heart. The figure reached out, its hand closing around her throat, and Amelia felt the weight of it press down on her, the pressure building, crushing the air from her lungs. She gasped for breath, her vision blurring as she was pulled deeper into the void. But then, something shifted. A light, a flicker, appeared in the distance, a faint glow in the oppressive darkness. For the first time, she felt something other than terror. Hope. A spark, no matter how small, that burned within her chest. She couldn't give up. She couldn't let the house win. With all the strength she could muster, she fought against the darkness, against the crushing weight of the figure's grip. She pushed forward, her body straining against the pull of the abyss. The light grew brighter, stronger, and for a moment, it felt as though she were breaking free. But then the figure's grip tightened, its cold fingers squeezing tighter, pulling her back into the darkness. "You can't leave," it whispered, its voice like the last breath of a dying man. "You belong here." Amelia felt her strength wane, her mind slipping into oblivion. She was losing. The house had won. But just as all hope seemed lost, a loud crash shattered the silence. The figure recoiled, its grip loosening. Amelia gasped for air, her vision clearing as the darkness around her began to dissipate. She didn't know what had happened, but she knew one thing. Something was fighting for her. Something had broken the hold of the house, even if only for a moment. The light continued to grow brighter, pulling her toward it. Amelia didn't hesitate. She reached for it, her hand outstretched, and with one final desperate push, she was pulled free from the darkness. Amelia awoke, her body limp and cold as though she had been lying motionless for hours. She gasped for air, her lungs filling with the sweet, refreshing oxygen that filled the room. The suffocating darkness had lifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she was no longer trapped in the house. But something was wrong. As she sat up, her surroundings felt strange. The room she was in was dimly lit, the soft glow of flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows across the walls. The air smelled faintly of incense, thick and sweet, and the floor beneath her felt solid, unlike the shifting, oppressive ground of the house she had been running through. But the house's presence lingered. It wasn't gone. Amelia's breath hitched as she turned her head, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar space. The walls were lined with shelves, their surfaces cluttered with odd trinkets and artifacts she couldn't recognize. Strange, grotesque figurines and candles shaped like twisted faces sat next to ancient tomes bound in leather, their titles unreadable. The room seemed more like a forgotten study or a ritual chamber, something out of place in time. Before she could process her surroundings, she heard a voice, a familiar, sinister whisper that slithered into her mind like a cold gust of wind. "You cannot escape. You cannot run." Her heart clenched, the terror of the house creeping back into her veins. She wasn't free. Not yet. Amelia pushed herself off the floor and stood, her legs weak but steady. She needed to escape this place, wherever it was. She couldn't afford to linger. The voice was still there, its words curling into her thoughts like a poison. Come, it beckoned. You will find no refuge. With shaky steps, Amelia moved toward the only exit, an arched wooden door at the far end of the room. She reached for the handle, the cold metal sending a jolt through her body. Her mind screamed at her to leave, but every instinct told her to turn back, to find another way. But there was no other way. The house, its grip, its power, still had her. It was just biding its time, watching her, waiting for her to falter. Amelia knew she had to fight. She opened the door. The hallway beyond was long and narrow, stretching into darkness. The walls were adorned with more strange symbols, the same twisted arcane markings she had seen before, pulsing with an eerie glow. The whispers were louder now, reverberating off the walls, filling the air with their cold, hollow tones. You will never leave, they chanted, a chorus of voices growing stronger with each step she took. Amelia's pulse quickened as she walked forward, her body shaking with dread. The hallway seemed endless, the darkness swallowing her whole. She reached the end, but the door she found there was not a way out. It was another room, another trap. She hesitated but pushed the door open, her heart hammering in her chest. The moment it creaked, the air seemed to grow colder, and the whispers grew deafening. Inside, a figure stood, silhouetted against the dim light. A man, or what used to be a man. His eyes were hollow pits, the skin stretched tight over his bones. He wore tattered robes, his hands extended toward her as though he were waiting for her to join him. You came here seeking answers, the figure said, its voice impossibly deep and echoing. But you should know, Amelia. The house has already claimed you. Her body went numb with fear, but she didn't back away. She couldn't. There was no escape. She had known it the moment she stepped into the house's grip. The figure's voice became a low growl. You are a part of it now. There is no return, no salvation. Amelia's chest tightened. The house, the force behind it, had been waiting for her, waiting for someone to enter, to fall into its trap, and become part of its dark, twisted reality. She had never stood a chance, and yet she had to fight. She couldn't give in. No, she whispered, her voice weak but defiant. I won't let you win. A strange silence filled the room. The figure's head tilted slightly, its expression unreadable. The shadows around it seemed to writhe, as though they were alive, feeding off her fear. The air grew thick, suffocating. You are already lost, the figure intoned, its hands rising to its chest in a slow, deliberate motion. All who enter this house become one with it. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know if it was her mind breaking, or if the figure was telling the truth. Either way, she couldn't surrender. The room seemed to warp around her, the walls shifting, twisting as if the house itself was responding to her resistance. The floor trembled beneath her feet. Amelia's hands clenched into fists, her body trembling with the energy she had to summon to resist. The whispers were so loud now, so close, it felt like they were inside her skull. But she fought them back, pushing against the dark presence that had gripped her mind. You will not win, she gasped. The figure's laughter rang out, deep and hollow, echoing in her ears. The sound felt like it was vibrating inside her chest. The darkness began to close in again, suffocating her, drowning out everything. But just as the figure stepped forward, closer to her, something inside Amelia snapped. A force, raw and powerful, surged through her, tearing away the veil of fear. The shadows recoiled, as if they were afraid of her, their whispers faltering. She reached out, and with every ounce of strength she could muster, she grabbed hold of the air, the room, the shadows. Her hands burned with an unseen energy. The house screamed. The walls trembled, the very foundation of the house shaking as though it were coming undone. The figure stumbled back, its hollow eyes widening in terror. Amelia's body, powered by sheer will and desperation, was no longer just fighting for survival. It was fighting for release, for the truth of the house to be revealed. The air pulsed around her, the shadows writhing, the whispers turning to screams. And then, with a final, deafening roar, the house shook violently, every wall cracking and splintering apart. Amelia fell to her knees, breathless, her body spent. The room around her began to collapse, the walls crumbling, the floor breaking apart. And yet, through the chaos, through the devastation, she felt a strange sensation. The weight had lifted. She was free. The darkness, the house, the shadows, they were gone. The whispers had stopped. The house had been torn apart, its grip broken. But she didn't have time to revel in the moment. The world around her was shifting, the remnants of the house falling away into nothingness. She had only moments before everything faded into the abyss. Amelia took a deep breath. She stood, and she walked forward into the light. The house was no more, and neither was she. The end. Next tale. The echoing silence. It was an ordinary evening when Clara first arrived at the old manor. The air was thick with mist, the kind that clung to the skin and made every breath feel heavier than the last. She had always been drawn to old, forgotten places. Places where time seemed to stand still, waiting for someone to awaken its memories. This particular house had been abandoned for decades, standing on the edge of a forgotten town, surrounded by thick woods that no one dared to enter. The locals had long since stopped talking about it, too afraid of what might still lurk inside its decaying walls. Clara, however, was different. She wasn't afraid. In fact, she had always been fascinated by stories of haunted houses, the kind of stories that made people shiver in the dark but intrigued her in ways she couldn't explain. She had always wanted to explore the unknown, to uncover secrets hidden beneath layers of dust and decay. As she stepped out of her car and gazed at the manor before her, she felt a strange pull, something almost magnetic, drawing her closer. The mansion loomed in front of her, dark and imposing, its windows like black eyes watching her every move. There was no sign of life, no movement, no hint of activity, and yet Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for her, something that had been waiting for a long time. She reached the front door and hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. The hinges groaned loudly in protest, the sound echoing through the empty hallways. The air inside was thick with the scent of mold and decay, the remnants of forgotten lives. She took a deep breath, the smell making her stomach turn, but her curiosity pushed her forward. She was here for a reason, and she wasn't about to turn back now. The foyer was grand, with a wide staircase that spiraled upward into the shadows. Dust clung to every surface, and the faded wallpaper peeled away in large strips, revealing the cracked, neglected walls beneath. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals long since covered in grime, but it still seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. Clara's footsteps echoed loudly as she ventured deeper into the manor, the silence oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath. waiting for her to make the first move. As she walked, she felt an odd sensation creeping up her spine, a sensation that told her she wasn't alone. It was just the house, she told herself. The house was old, and old houses had a way of making you feel like you were being watched. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, persistent, like an itch that couldn't be scratched. Clara paused at the entrance to the grand parlor, her hand hovering over the door handle. The room was dimly lit by the fading light from the outside, the windows covered in a thick layer of grime that distorted the world beyond. She couldn't help but feel a chill run down her spine as she pushed open the door. The room was large and empty, with the remnants of old furniture scattered about, covered in white sheets. The once beautiful hardwood floors were now warped and cracked, and the grand fireplace stood cold and dark, its mantel covered in layers of dust. The air in the room felt stagnant, like the house had been holding its breath for years, waiting for something to happen. Clara walked further into the room, her eyes scanning the walls, the corners, every shadow. There was something strange about the way the room felt, something that made her uneasy. As she turned toward the far corner, her eyes caught a glimpse of something that didn't belong. A door. A small door, barely noticeable, tucked away in the corner behind a faded curtain. It wasn't the kind of door one would expect to find in a place like this, narrow and worn, with a brass handle that had been tarnished by years of neglect. It was almost as if it had been hidden on purpose. Without thinking, Clara moved toward it, her hand brushing against the heavy velvet curtain. As she approached the door, a cold breeze swept through the room, causing the curtains to flutter slightly, and for a moment, Clara swore she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. A shadow, fleeting, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. Shaking off the feeling of unease, she reached for the door handle. It turned easily in her hand, as if it had been waiting for her. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this. She had thought the house would be empty, abandoned, but this felt like something more. The air was cooler here, heavier, as if the very atmosphere was different in the hidden space beneath the manor. Clara stood at the top of the stairs for a moment, staring into the blackness below. Something told her to turn back, to leave the house and never return. But her curiosity was stronger. With a deep breath, Clara stepped down into the darkness. The stairs creaked beneath her weight, the sound reverberating in the silence like a warning. With each step, the air grew colder, the silence deeper. The darkness seemed to press in on her, as if the very walls of the house were closing in around her. Her heart pounded in her chest, her footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness. At the bottom of the stairs, Clara found herself in a small, windowless room. The only light came from a single, flickering bulb overhead, casting strange shadows on the walls. The room was empty, save for a large, ornate mirror mounted on the far wall. Clara's eyes were immediately drawn to it. The mirror was old, its frame carved from dark wood, intricately designed with patterns that seemed to shift and twist in the dim light. The glass was cracked in several places, but still it held a strange beauty, a pull that Clara couldn't resist. She stepped closer, her reflection growing larger with every step. But as she gazed into the mirror, her reflection began to change. At first, it was subtle, just a shift in the light, a flicker of movement. But then, as Clara leaned closer, she saw it. Her reflection was no longer mimicking her movements. It was different. In the mirror, Clara saw herself standing still, staring back at her with wide, frightened eyes. But the reflection didn't stop there. Slowly, it began to smile. Not the smile Clara was making, but something twisted, something wrong. Her heart skipped a beat. This wasn't possible. The reflection in the mirror grinned wider, its eyes dark and hollow. Clara's pulse raced as she backed away from the mirror, her breath coming in shallow gasps. But it was too late. The reflection reached out of the glass, its fingers stretching toward her, and then everything went black. Clara's eyes snapped open, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She was no longer standing in front of the mirror, nor was she in the cold, dim room beneath the manor. Instead, she found herself lying in a bed, drenched in sweat, her heart still racing with terror. For a moment, she was disoriented, the remnants of the nightmare clinging to her like a heavy fog. The air felt thick and heavy, stifling, as though it had been trapped inside for years. Clara sat up, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. She was in a room she didn't recognize, the furniture antique and worn, draped with layers of dust. The walls, too, were covered in faded wallpaper, yellowed with age. The scent of mildew hung in the air, and the light filtering through the cracked window was weak and sickly. Had she been brought here? The last thing she remembered was standing before the mirror, the reflection in it smiling, grinning at her. Then nothing. Clara's gaze wandered around the room, searching for any clue as to where she was. The bed she lay in was large, its dark wooden frame carved with intricate designs. The nightstand beside her was cluttered with old, dusty books, their pages yellowed and brittle. A small lamp sat on top, the bulb flickering weakly as though it were struggling to stay on. It was clear the room had not been lived in for a long time. A chill ran down her spine as she noticed something strange. There was no sound. The house was silent, unnaturally so. Even the faintest noise of creaking wood or shifting air was absent. Clara strained her ears, but the silence remained absolute. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood, her body unsteady, as though she had just awoken from a long, deep sleep. Her head spun, and she had to hold herself steady against the bedpost to avoid falling. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in on her from all sides. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. The door to the room was slightly ajar, and Clara felt a strange compulsion to open it. She approached the door cautiously, her hand trembling as she grasped the cold handle. As she pulled the door open, the hallway beyond stretched out into the darkened distance. The house seemed even more vast than she had realized, stretching far beyond what she had seen when she first arrived. The wallpaper in the hallway was the same as in the room, faded and peeling, but there was something else. The air here felt different, thick with the weight of old memories, as though the very walls were alive with them, watching her every movement. With a hesitant step, Clara moved into the hall, the floorboards creaking under her weight. She tried to call out, but her voice seemed muffled, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that someone or something was lurking just beyond her vision. A sound broke the silence, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A low whisper, like a voice calling her name from the darkness. Clara. The voice murmured, barely audible. Clara froze. Her breath caught in her throat as she strained her ears, trying to identify the source of the whisper. The voice had come from deeper down the hall, from somewhere in the shadows where the light didn't quite reach. It was soft, faint, but unmistakable. It was a voice she recognized, but the more she tried to focus on it, the more it seemed to slip away from her. She took a cautious step forward, then another, each footstep feeling like it echoed too loudly in the unnatural silence. Her pulse quickened with each movement. The walls around her seemed to press in closer, and the air grew colder, heavier. She rounded a corner and found herself at the end of another long hallway. At the far end, she could see an old wooden door, its edges warped with age, the paint chipped and peeling. It seemed like it had been untouched for years. As Clara moved toward it, the whispering grew louder, more distinct, filling her head with 1,000 voices all speaking at once. The sound was overwhelming, drowning out her thoughts, until one voice broke through, clear and chilling. "Don't go in there," it whispered urgently. "It's too late." Clara hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle. The voice was right. Something was wrong. But her curiosity, her drive to understand what was happening, pushed her forward. She turned the handle and opened the door. The room beyond was unlike the others in the house. Instead of the dust and decay she had expected, it was pristine, untouched, as though it had been frozen in time. The furniture was elegant, draped in fine fabrics, the wood gleaming as though it had just been polished. The room was empty, save for one object, the mirror. It stood against the far wall, large and imposing, its surface polished to a perfect sheen. The frame was ornate, gold with intricate carvings, but what caught Clara's attention were the eyes. They weren't just any eyes. They were her eyes, staring back at her from the reflection, wide and filled with an unmistakable terror. The reflection moved, but Clara didn't. The figure in the mirror grinned at her again, its smile growing wider and more twisted. The same twisted grin from before. Clara took a step back, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She wanted to look away, to turn and run, but she couldn't. She was frozen, staring at the figure as it reached toward the glass. "Clara," the figure whispered, its voice an echo of her own. "You belong to me." The glass rippled like water, distorting the reflection, as though the mirror itself were alive. Clara could feel the pull of it, an irresistible force tugging at her, drawing her in. Her reflection smiled again, but this time it wasn't just a smile, it was a full, mocking laugh. Before Clara could react, the glass began to crack, the sound sharp and violent, like 1,000 whispers shattering at once. The crack spread quickly, spiraling out from the center, and in an instant, the entire surface shattered. But it wasn't just the glass that shattered. The room itself seemed to shake, the walls trembling, as if the manor was coming alive around her. Clara stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. The floor beneath her feet cracked and splintered, and she realized too late that the room was beginning to collapse. From the shattered mirror, something reached out toward her, long, bony fingers, their skin like dead flesh, grasping at the air. A shadow poured out of the cracks, moving like smoke, swirling around her legs, tugging at her ankles. Her scream was swallowed by the darkness as the world around her collapsed, the floor giving way beneath her feet, sending her into a void that stretched out endlessly. Clara's body fell, tumbling through the blackness, the void swallowing her whole. There was no ground beneath her, no sense of direction, only the sensation of weightlessness as if she were suspended in a deep, cold nothing. Her chest tightened, her breath quickening, but she couldn't grasp anything. There was no air to fight against, no wind to feel, just the sensation of falling into an endless abyss. She tried to scream, but her voice was lost to the void, swallowed by the very air around her. The silence was deafening, and the deeper she fell, the more it pressed in on her, suffocating her thoughts, drowning her sense of reality. Her mind raced, desperate for something, anything to stop the fall. But there was no end, no bottom, just endless, consuming darkness. Then, with a sudden jolt, her fall stopped. It wasn't a gentle landing. It felt like being slammed against a hard surface, her body hitting with such force that she gasped in pain, the air knocked from her lungs. Her head spun, disoriented and dizzy, but slowly she forced her eyes open. She was no longer in the void. She was back in the manor, but it was different. The hallway around her was even darker than before, the shadows deeper, more alive. It was as if the very structure of the house had changed, warped, bent into something unnatural. The walls seemed to pulse with a faint, rhythmic thrum, like a heartbeat, slow, steady, and ominous. Clara pushed herself up from the cold floor, her limbs heavy, the air thick with a strange presence. Her senses were assaulted by an overwhelming smell of decay, of damp earth, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the suffering of countless years. She could feel something lurking, something watching, but there was no movement, no sound, just the oppressive silence. She tried to speak, to call out, but the words died in her throat, swallowed by the house. Her own voice seemed alien here, out of place. Her head throbbed with pain as she stood shakily, trying to get her bearings. The house had always been dark and foreboding, but now it felt alive. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was something tangible, a presence that stretched and curled, creeping closer with every breath she took. Clara's eyes darted around, searching for any escape, but the hallway stretched on forever, impossibly long, the walls closing in around her. The oppressive weight of the air pressed against her chest, and she felt a wave of nausea rise up from her stomach. Then, from the corner of her eye, Clara saw it. A figure. It was standing at the end of the hallway, just beyond the dim light of the flickering bulb. At first, it was just a shape, a dark silhouette that seemed to dissolve into the shadows, but as she stared, it began to solidify, its outline becoming more defined. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs too long, its body thin and twisted. The figure's face was obscured in darkness, but Clara could feel its eyes on her, burning, pulling her in. The figure stood perfectly still, not moving, but the air around it seemed to distort, warping like the reflection in a cracked mirror. Clara's heart raced as she stood frozen, unable to move, unable to tear her gaze away. Every instinct told her to run, to flee, but her body refused to obey. It was like the house itself had taken control, like the shadows were drawing her in, forcing her to face whatever this thing was. The figure took a step toward her, and with every movement, the air seemed to grow colder. The sound of its footsteps was like the scraping of nails against a chalkboard, sharp and grating, echoing down the empty hall. Clara felt the cold seep into her bones, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. She wanted to scream, but her throat felt raw, like something was blocking her voice. As the figure came closer, Clara felt her pulse pounding in her ears, the world around her narrowing to a single point. She couldn't look away, even as it stepped into the dim light, revealing more of its grotesque form. Its face was now visible, or at least what could be called a face. It was stretched and distorted, a hollow mask with empty black eyes that seemed to stare directly into her soul. The skin was gray and mottled, like rotting flesh, and its mouth was a jagged slit, frozen in a permanent, mocking grin. Clara's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped closer, its presence filling the hallway. She could feel its cold, unnatural energy, a force that seemed to leach all warmth from the air around her. Every inch it moved forward was an inch that felt like it would consume her. Her legs shook, her body trembling from head to toe, but still she couldn't move. "Clara." A voice hissed from the figure's mouth, low and distorted. It was not its voice, but hers. Her own voice, twisted, guttural, like an echo from the past. "You should have never come back." The words cut through her like a blade. The house. It knew her name. It knew everything. She had been drawn into this place, into this nightmare, and now she was trapped. There was no escape. There was no way out. "Why?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible, her chest tightening as she struggled to breathe. The figure tilted its head, the motion jerky, unnatural, as though it were a puppet on strings. It seemed to contemplate her words for a long moment before its mouth stretched into an even wider grin, the edges of its lips cracking, exposing blackened teeth. "Because you're already a part of it," the figure said, its voice distorted and hollow, like it came from the depths of the earth itself. "The house chose you long ago, Clara. You were always meant to be here." Clara stumbled back, her back hitting the wall. Panic surged through her as she realized what the figure was saying. The house, the manor, had been calling to her all this time. It had never let her go. She was part of it now, just like the others who had come before her, drawn into the abyss and lost to its dark, hungry embrace. Before she could react, the figure lunged forward, its arms stretching impossibly long, grabbing her by the shoulders with a force that made her body freeze in place. Her scream was trapped in her throat as the world around her began to warp, the walls spinning, the air thick with a suffocating weight. The figure's grin widened, its fingers digging into her skin. She could feel its cold breath against her neck, its laughter filling her mind like 1,000 voices whispering, calling, pulling. "You're never leaving, Clara. You're one of us now." And then everything went dark. Clara awoke, though her mind was hazy, disjointed, as if she had been asleep for an eternity. Her body felt heavy, like it was submerged in something cold and dense. Her arms and legs were stiff, aching as if they hadn't moved in years. She opened her eyes, but the world around her was indistinct, blurred, as though she were submerged in water, her vision rippling with a strange, liquid distortion. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. She tried to sit up, but her head throbbed violently, a sharp, pounding ache that left her dizzy. Panic surged within her chest as she realized she couldn't move. Her limbs were bound. She struggled, pulling against invisible restraints, but they held her fast, unyielding. Slowly, her senses began to return, and the room around her began to take shape. She was no longer in the hallway, nor in the manor. She was in a small, dimly lit room, the walls made of rough stone, cold to the touch. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, and the floor beneath her was hard, unforgiving. She was lying on a stone slab, her body bound with chains that were thick, rusted, and cold against her skin. Clara's heart pounded as the reality of her situation sank in. She was trapped. There was no escape. The house, it had done this to her. Whatever had taken hold of her, whatever force she had angered by returning to this cursed place, had claimed her. She could feel it now, like a weight pressing down on her chest, a dark presence that loomed over her, suffocating her. A low growl echoed from the shadows of the room. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she turned her head toward the source of the sound. In the far corner, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. It was hunched, twisted, its form distorted and unnatural. The air around it seemed to shimmer, rippling with a dark, unholy energy. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, and as it did, Clara felt a cold rush of fear flood her veins. She knew this creature, or at least, she had seen its shadow in the mirror. The one that had haunted her, watching her every move, whispering in the dark. But now it was real. It was here. The creature's face came into view, though it was no longer human. Its skin was mottled and decayed, a sickly gray-green hue that clung to its skeletal frame. Its eyes, hollow and empty, bore into Clara with a ferocity that made her skin crawl. The mouth, wide and gaping, split open into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth, the kind that no living thing should possess. Clara tried to scream, but the words caught in her throat. She was frozen, paralyzed by fear as the creature approached, its breath ragged and labored, like the sound of wind rustling through dead leaves. "You shouldn't have returned," the creature rasped, its voice low and gravelly, like a whisper carried on the wind. "You were warned." Clara's pulse raced, and she tried again to break free, to fight against the chains that held her. But the more she struggled, the tighter they seemed to become, until she could hardly breathe. The weight of the creature's presence pressed in on her, making it harder to think, harder to escape. The creature leaned closer, its face only inches from hers now. She could smell the decay in its breath, thick and rancid, like the scent of old grave dirt. "You belong to the house now," it whispered, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves, cold and distant. "It has claimed you. There is no escape." Clara's mind screamed for her to act, to do something, but her body refused to move. The chains, the darkness, it all felt like a part of her, binding her to the very house that had ensnared her. She was trapped in a nightmare that had no end, no escape. Tears filled her eyes as she realized the truth. She had become a part of the house's twisted design, just another lost soul bound to its will. The creature had been right. She had no place here, but neither did it. It, like all the others before it, was a victim of the house, born from its ancient curse. A low, guttural laugh escaped from the creature's mouth as it backed away, its eyes gleaming with a dark, malevolent satisfaction. "You'll understand soon enough," it said, its voice fading into the shadows. As it vanished into the darkness, Clara's vision blurred once more, and a strange, overwhelming fatigue washed over her. Her eyelids grew heavy, and the world around her began to fade into a dark, cold haze. But just before the darkness took her, a new voice echoed in her mind, a voice so faint that she almost couldn't hear it. It was a whisper, soft and fragile, like a breeze carried on the wind. "Run." The word was barely a thought, but it sent a spark of hope racing through Clara's chest. She had to escape. She had to find a way out of this nightmare. The house was alive, and it was hungry, but Clara wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. With the last of her strength, she focused on the chains that held her, willing her body to move, willing the power of that whisper to give her the strength to fight back. The chains creaked as they tightened, the rusted metal groaning in protest. But Clara pushed harder, her muscles straining, her mind forcing her body to obey. With a final, desperate pull, the chains snapped. She was free. Clara gasped, taking in a breath of air that felt cooler, fresher than it had in what seemed like forever. She didn't waste a moment. The creature was gone, but the house was still there, watching, waiting. She didn't know how much time she had, but she knew she had to move. She bolted to her feet, her legs unsteady beneath her, but she ignored the weakness in her limbs. She had to get out. There was no time to hesitate, no time to think. She could feel the house closing in, its walls shifting, its rooms rearranging themselves as if to trap her forever. Clara stumbled toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The door was slightly ajar, beckoning her. The hallway beyond was dark, but she could feel a faint pull, a direction to follow, like a thread leading her out of the nightmare. But as her hand touched the door handle, a voice echoed behind her. A voice that was both familiar and foreign. "You can't run." The voice was everywhere, surrounding her, filling her mind, and Clara knew with a sickening certainty that the house was alive. It had always been alive, and it would never let her go. Clara's hand trembled on the cold metal door handle, the sensation of it pressing against her skin sending a wave of nausea through her body. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The voice had spoken again, its chilling words echoing in her mind like a grim reminder of the fate that awaited her. "You can't run." The voice didn't belong to the creature, nor did it belong to anyone she could remember. It was something older, something deeper, like the house itself was speaking to her. A living, breathing thing that had waited for her return, feeding on her fear. Clara's fingers clenched around the door handle, and despite the terror clawing at her insides, she knew she had to move. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let the house consume her like it had the others. With a deep breath, Clara turned the handle, pushing the door open just enough to slip through. The hallway beyond was dark, the air thick with a familiar scent of decay, of things left to rot in the forgotten corners of time. But there was something different now. The house was alive, more than ever. She could feel it, like the pulse of a heartbeat that reverberated through the very walls, vibrating in the air around her. The shadows seemed to writhe, to stretch and curl, as if they were alive, reaching for her, hungry. Clara's steps were hesitant at first, each one echoing in the oppressive silence of the house. She had no plan, no clear direction, only the desperate urge to escape, to get away from the ever-growing sense of dread that pressed down on her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. She didn't know where the front door was, didn't know if it even existed anymore. All she could do was keep moving, keep running, and hope that whatever path she followed would lead her out of this nightmare. But the house was watching her. She could feel it. Its presence was everywhere. The shadows seemed to twist in her peripheral vision, and the silence was broken only by the faint sound of footsteps behind her, soft and deliberate. Every time she turned her head, there was nothing, no one. Yet she could still hear them, echoing, insistent. Her pace quickened, but the darkness grew thicker with each step. The walls closed in on her, the air grew colder, and the feeling of being hunted intensified. She couldn't tell if it was the house or the creatures within it that were after her, but the walls felt like they were pressing in from all sides, the narrow corridors tightening around her. As Clara turned a corner, she nearly stumbled, catching herself against the wall as a low, guttural growl vibrated the air. She froze, heart racing, eyes scanning the dim light ahead. There, at the far end of the hallway, stood the figure. The same twisted silhouette, dark and unmoving, its eyes burning with that same unsettling blackness. The creature's form seemed to pulse with the shadows, the dark veins of the house weaving through its body like a part of it, tethered to the walls, to the very foundation. Clara's breath caught in her throat. This time, she didn't dare move. She knew better. She couldn't outrun it. Not in this house. Not with its walls bending and shifting, trapping her. And then, to her horror, the figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Each step made the shadows around it writhe and twist, the air thickening with the weight of its presence. The growl grew louder, a low rumble that vibrated in the pit of her stomach, sending a wave of terror through her entire body. Clara. The voice came again, distorted, layered with an unnatural echo. You think you can escape? Clara's heart skipped a beat. The voice was the same one she had heard before, the one that had whispered to her in the darkness. But it was different now, closer, more real. The figure moved closer, its steps slow, like a predator toying with its prey. The shadows around it seemed to stretch, swallowing the light from the flickering bulbs above. Clara's legs trembled beneath her, but she forced herself to move. She turned, bolting down the hallway, her footsteps crashing against the floor, frantic, desperate. She could hear the creature's movements behind her, its growl growing louder, closer, as if it were right on her heels. She turned another corner, her mind racing. The house was changing, warping. She wasn't sure if the hallway was longer, or if she was just losing track of time, but it felt like the walls were closing in. Her breath was coming in ragged gasps, and the darkness seemed to grow thicker the farther she ran. It was swallowing her whole. Suddenly, she skidded to a halt, her heart freezing in her chest. Ahead of her, at the end of the hall, was a door. It wasn't the front door, but it was a door. The only door she could see. Without hesitation, Clara charged forward, her fingers shaking as she reached for the handle. But as her hand made contact, the door jolted violently, as if something on the other side had slammed into it with a force that rattled her frame. Clara froze, the sudden noise making her blood run cold. The growl from behind her was louder now, closer, more ferocious, and she could feel the weight of it, pressing down on her, threatening to crush her. She yanked at the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the other side. Panic surged within her, and she slammed her shoulder against the door, trying to break through. It didn't move. She slammed into it again, her strength faltering, exhaustion starting to creep in. The creature was getting closer. She could hear its feet shuffling on the floor, dragging across the stone like nails on a chalkboard. Clara. The voice came again, a soft, cruel whisper. It's too late. She heard the unmistakable sound of the chains rattling, their cold metal scraping against the floor as they dragged closer. The creature's form grew larger, its twisted, skeletal limbs stretching out toward her. The hallway seemed to narrow, closing in on her. She was standing in the corner, her face obscured by the shadows, but Clara could feel the same presence radiating from her, familiar but different. The woman was staring directly at her, her eyes glowing faintly, like embers. The air around her seemed to shimmer, a subtle, pulsing energy that made Clara's skin tingle. Who is she? The creature behind Clara stopped in its tracks, its face twisting into a grimace. For a brief moment, it seemed to hesitate, but Clara didn't wait for it to act. She focused all her remaining strength on the woman in the corner, as if her very presence was the key to breaking the house's hold on her. With trembling hands, Clara pushed herself to her feet, unsteady, her body feeling weak. But she didn't look away from the woman. There was something in her eyes, a promise of hope. "Help me," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse. "Please." The woman's lips parted slightly, as if she were about to speak, but no sound came. Instead, The shadows around her seemed to twist and writhe, and in the blink of an eye, she was suddenly standing directly in front of Clara, as though she had crossed the distance in an instant. Clara gasped, her heart racing. She couldn't understand what was happening. The house seemed to tremble with the movement, as though it too was reacting to the woman's presence. The woman reached out, her hands trembling as she touched Clara's arm. The sensation was ice cold, sending a shock of electricity through her. A surge of energy flooded Clara's mind, images flashing through her consciousness in rapid succession. The house, the curse, the creatures that had been trapped here for centuries, bound to the house by its dark magic. She saw faces, many faces. All of them were victims. All of them, like her, had been drawn in, trapped, consumed by the darkness. The woman's voice finally broke through, soft but strong. "You are not alone," she said. "This place is more than just a house. It is a prison for souls like ours. But there is a way to break free, to end this." Clara's head spun with the words, with the weight of the truth. The house was not just a structure. It was a being, a living thing, a dark entity that fed on souls, that grew stronger with each new victim. But the woman was offering her something, hope, a way to break the cycle. "I can help you," the woman continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you have to trust me." Clara nodded, her heart thudding in her chest. The creature behind her growled in warning, its form shifting, twisting, but Clara barely heard it now. She was focused on the woman in front of her, the faint warmth of her presence in this sea of cold darkness. Clara could feel it, the binding, the connection between herself and the house was weakening. It was still there, lingering like a shadow in the corners of her mind, but now she could fight it. With one final glance at the creature that had tormented her, Clara turned and ran, her feet pounding against the cold stone floor. She could feel the woman beside her, her presence guiding her, pushing her toward freedom. But as they moved toward the door, the house let out one final, deafening cry. Clara ran, her heart thundering in her chest as she sprinted toward the exit, the door ahead of her now visible in the dim light. Behind her, the growl of the creature deepened, a primal, guttural sound that echoed through the hallways like the roar of a beast sensing its prey slipping away. But Clara didn't dare look back. She couldn't. If she did, if she gave the creature any more of her attention, it might find a way to pull her back into its suffocating grasp. The woman was still by her side, moving as if she were part of the shadows themselves. Clara could feel her presence, a steady, guiding force, pulling her forward, urging her to keep running. Despite the fear that gripped her, despite the terror threatening to break her will, Clara pushed forward. She had come too far. She had endured too much. This was the only chance she would ever have to escape. As they neared the door, Clara's body screamed for rest. Her legs felt like lead, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. The pulse of the house reverberated beneath her feet, vibrating through her body like a constant, relentless thrum. She could feel the walls closing in again, the shadows stretching out toward her, but the woman, the guide, was still there, pulling her onward. "Keep going," the woman whispered, her voice filled with strength. "You're almost there. The house is weak now." Clara didn't know how the woman knew this, but she didn't question it. She focused on the door, on the possibility of freedom. It was close, closer than it had ever been before. She could taste it. Freedom, light, light. The door was within arm's reach now, the cold metal gleaming in the dim light. Clara reached out, her fingers trembling as they touched the handle. For a moment, it didn't budge. The house seemed to resist her, as though it was clinging to her very soul, trying to keep her trapped within its decaying walls. But Clara would not be stopped. She gripped the handle tighter, her nails digging into the cold metal, and with all her remaining strength, she yanked the door open. The house screamed. The sound was deafening, a bone-shaking cry that seemed to tear through the very fabric of reality. Clara recoiled, her body vibrating from the force of it. The walls trembled, the floor beneath her feet cracked, and for a moment, the very air seemed to shudder in agony. But she didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, through the door, into the unknown. The moment she crossed the threshold, the world around her seemed to warp, as though the very space had folded in on itself. The house shrieked one final time, a sound of fury, of rage, and then it stopped. Clara stumbled forward, the door slamming shut behind her. She gasped for breath, her chest heaving, her body drenched in sweat. The woman was beside her, but for the first time, Clara looked at her fully. She wasn't like the creature, no longer a shadowy form. She looked unhuman. Her face was pale but calm, her expression serene as she studied Clara, her eyes filled with a quiet knowing. Clara blinked, trying to gather her bearings. She had no idea where she was now. The house had vanished. The darkness was gone, replaced by a strange pale light that seemed to come from nowhere, illuminating the empty landscape before them. "Where are we?" Clara asked, her voice hoarse. The woman smiled faintly. "This is the place between what was and what will be." Clara's brow furrowed. "But what happened to the house? The creature? They're gone," the woman replied simply, her voice gentle but firm. "The house has been broken. The creature, it was tied to its power. Now, it can never follow you again." Clara looked behind her, expecting to see the house, to feel its oppressive weight pressing down on her again. But there was nothing, just an open expanse, quiet and still. The darkness that had consumed her for so long was finally gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of peace. "But how?" Clara whispered. How did we break it?" The woman looked at her with a knowing smile. "You did it. You and the others before you. All the souls trapped here, bound to the house by fear, by the darkness. It wasn't just the house that needed to be broken. It was the curse that had tied all of you to it. Your fear, your despair, they gave it power. But you resisted. You fought back." Clara shook her head, confused. "I didn't fight. I didn't even know what I was fighting." The woman placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You didn't need to know. Sometimes all it takes is the will to escape, the strength to keep moving, even when everything tells you to give up. That is what broke the house. Your hope." Clara felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. She had been so close to losing herself, so close to becoming another victim of the house's twisted hunger. And now, it was over. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt truly free. "Thank you," Clara whispered, her voice shaking with the weight of her relief. The woman nodded, her expression softening. "There is no need to thank me. I am just a guide. But now you must move on. You must live. This is the end of your journey here. But it is only the beginning of the life you have yet to live." Clara looked at her heart full of gratitude. She didn't know where this place was or what came next, But she knew one thing for certain. She had escaped. She had survived. The house had no claim on her anymore. As the woman faded into the light, Clara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the darkness finally lift. She stepped forward, walking into the unknown with the knowledge that whatever lay ahead, she was no longer a prisoner. And behind her, the house, the creature, and all the nightmares within it slowly faded into nothingness, lost to time, to the very void from which they had come. Clara was free. The end. Thank you so much for joining me on this terrifying journey through these stories. If you enjoyed the 3 chilling tales and the suspense that kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more. I bring you a new story every day, so make sure you don't miss out on the next one. Until then, sleep tight, and remember, not all things that go bump in the night stay hidden for long. See you in the next video.